Hello there, and a very gentle welcome. I hope you have found a comfortable place to settle in, somewhere quiet where the world can fade away for a little while. Whether you are here to learn, to relax, or to let your mind drift towards sleep, you are most welcome. Tonight, or perhaps this morning depending on where you are, we are turning our attention from the quiet histories of objects and ideas to the tumultuous history of a man. A story of ambition, fate, and the corrosive power of a single thought. As we begin, I am always quietly curious about the community that gathers here in this space. If you feel so inclined, I would be grateful if you would leave a comment below, letting us know from what part of the world you are tuning in and what time of day it is for you. It is a quiet comfort to know we are sharing this story across so many places and so many hours. But for now, let us leave the present behind. Let the noise of the day fall away and the responsibilities of tomorrow wait. Let us travel back nearly 1,000 years to a cold, wet kingdom in the north. Let us travel to Scotland. The air itself was a wet sheet, heavy and clinging, tasting of iron and churned mud. The great noise of the world had faded. After days of clamour and struggle, a profound quiet had fallen over the land. It was the kind of deep, weary peace that only comes after a long and difficult storm has passed. The sky, once a turbulent grey, was now a soft, unbroken blanket of mist, and the rain had softened from a downpour into a fine, whispering drizzle that settled on the heather like dew. Upon a small, rolling hill, two men stood, though they were leaning on their swords more for rest than for readiness. Their armour was scarred and their cloaks were heavy with damp, but the fierce light of battle had left their eyes. They were simply two tired men, glad for the silence. The first was Macbeth, the Thane of Glamis, a good soldier who felt the hollowness that follows a great effort. The other was his old and trusted friend, Banquo, whose steady presence was as reliable as the northern star. They had done their duty for their king, and now they were waiting for the world to feel normal again. Macbeth watched the mist swirl and drift across the heath. It moved without sound, a silent, grey river that softened the edges of the world, making the distant hills seem like sleeping giants. In the stillness, every small sound was clear. The soft sigh of the breeze, the drip of water from a gorse bush, the steady, rhythmic sound of his own breathing. He felt emptied out, as if the battle had scoured him clean, leaving behind only this vast, quiet emptiness. It was into this quiet that they came. They did not arrive with a sound, they simply appeared, coalescing from the thickest parts of the mist, as if the fog itself had decided to take on a shape. There were three of them. They were stooped and ancient, their forms so bent and weathered they seemed less like people and more like figures carved from old, dark wood. Their clothes were the colour of wet earth and moss, and they drifted over the ground without a sound, their feet never seeming to crush a single blade of grass. They came to a stop a short distance away, their heads tilted, their dark eyes seeming to hold an ancient, unreadable knowledge. They were strange, yes, but in the dreamlike quiet of the misty heath, they felt less like a threat and more like a natural part of the strange afternoon. Banquo spoke first, his voice hushed, careful not to shatter the stillness. "Speak, if you can," he murmured. "What are you?" The first figure raised a long, thin hand, and its voice was like the sound of dry leaves skittering across a stone floor, a dry and rustling whisper. "All hail Macbeth," it breathed. "Hail to thee, Thane of Glamis." The sound was soft, but the words were clear. Macbeth felt a faint tremor of surprise. They knew him. The second figure then spoke, its voice a little deeper, like a low sigh of wind. "All hail Macbeth. Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor." This second title hung in the air, a quiet puzzle. The Thane of Cawdor was still alive, though he was a traitor to the king. It was a strange thing to say, a riddle spoken in the mist. And then the third figure, almost hidden in its own shadow, spoke in a voice that was barely a sound at all. It was a whisper that seemed to travel not through the air, but directly into the quiet, hollow space within Macbeth's mind. "All hail Macbeth," it whispered, "that shalt be king hereafter." King. The word did not land like a thunderclap. It landed like a single, perfect drop of rain falling into a still, deep pool of water, its ripples spreading out slowly, silently, into the farthest corners of his awareness. It was a thought so vast and distant that it felt less like a promise and more like a dream he was half remembering. Banquo, ever steady, looked from the strange figures to his friend's quiet, wondering face. He asked them if they could indeed see into the seeds of time to speak to him as well. The three figures turned their heads in perfect, slow unison, and their whispered voices overlapped, weaving together like threads of smoke. "Lesser than Macbeth, and greater," said the first. "Not so happy, yet much happier," said the second. "Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none," breathed the third, and with a final sighing chorus of "all hail," they began to fade. They did not walk away. They simply grew thin, translucent, dissolving back into the mist from which they had come, until nothing was left but the shifting grey and the profound, listening silence. For a long moment, the two men stood without speaking, the echoes of the whispers still seeming to hang in the air around them. "Whither are they vanished?" Banquo wondered softly. "Into the air," Macbeth replied, his voice distant. The world felt thin, as though one could press a hand through it. Would they have stayed? Just as the last traces of the strange encounter began to feel like a shared dream, a new sound reached them, the muffled hoofbeats of horses drawing near. Two riders emerged from the fog, the Thanes of Ross and Angus, messengers from King Duncan. Their faces were bright with good news. They spoke of the king's great joy at the victory, and of the praises being sung for Macbeth's valour throughout the kingdom. Then Ross, with a warm smile, delivered his main purpose. "And for an earnest of a greater honour," he said, his voice kind, "he bade me, from him, call thee Thane of Cawdor." The words were a perfect, quiet echo of the second whisper on the heath. Macbeth looked at Banquo, whose eyes were wide with a gentle, slow dawning wonder. The strange riddle was beginning to solve itself. "What?" Banquo murmured, his voice full of awe. "Can the devil speak true?" The traitorous Thane of Cawdor, Angus explained, had confessed his treason and was to be executed. His title and his lands were now given to Macbeth as a reward for his loyalty. Glamis, and now Cawdor. The two truths settled in Macbeth's mind, not with a jolt, but with a deep, resonant quiet. The witch's words had not been a mad fantasy. They were a map, and two of the landmarks had now been passed. The third, the final destination, the impossible whisper of King, no longer seemed like a distant star. It felt closer now, a quiet possibility waiting at the end of the road. This knowledge did not ignite a fire of ambition within him. It was much quieter than that. It was like a key, turning softly in a lock he hadn't even known was there, opening a door into a room he had never dared to imagine. He barely heard the rest of the pleasantries. He was lost in the landscape of his own thoughts, a place that was suddenly wider and more mysterious than it had been an hour before. A silent question had been asked of the world, and the world had quietly answered twice. As he and Banquo mounted their horses to ride and meet the king, Macbeth felt a change within him. It was not a violent shift, but a gentle, profound turning, like a great ship slowly changing its course in a deep and silent sea. The loyal soldier was still there, but now he walked beside a new companion, a man who carried a quiet, wondrous, and heavy secret, and together they rode on through the fading light. The great hall at the king's temporary court in Forres was a space transformed by relief, where for weeks there had been the hurried footsteps of anxious messengers and the low, tense hum of war councils. There was now a warm and gentle harmony. Tall beeswax candles, a luxury saved for such occasions, burned with a clean, steady light, their soft glow pooling on the heavy oak tables and catching the threads of silver in the old tapestries on the walls. The air, once sharp with the metallic scent of worry, was now soft with the aromas of mulled wine, roasting meats, and the comforting smell of wood smoke from the central hearth. At the heart of this gentle scene sat King Duncan. He was not a king who commanded by fear or by a show of force. His presence was a calming one. The lines on his face were not marks of harshness, but maps of a long life spent in thoughtful care for his people. Tonight, those lines were softened by a deep and genuine joy. He looked out upon the faces of his thanes, his loyal lords, and saw not subjects, but his extended family, saved from the precipice of ruin. His smile was unguarded, his quiet laughter frequent as he listened to the tales of the final battles. When the heavy door opened and Macbeth and Banquo entered, a hush fell, but it was not a silence of ceremony. It was a soft, shared breath of reverence. All eyes turned to the two men who had stood as the kingdom's shield. The king, with a grace that belied his age, rose from his carved chair and walked to meet them, his own goblet of wine still in his hand. He did not wait for them to approach the throne. He set his cup down and placed his hands on Macbeth's shoulders, his grip warm and firm. "O worthiest cousin," he said, his voice not booming for the hall to hear, but spoken low for Macbeth alone. It was a personal, heartfelt thanks. "The sin of my ingratitude even now was heavy on me. To know what you have done, and to have no swift way to reward it, is a torment." Macbeth bowed his head, a gesture of humility that felt deeply familiar, a posture he had held before his king 100 times. The words of a loyal thane came to his lips, as they always had. "The service and the loyalty I owe in doing it pays itself," he replied, his voice even and respectful. But behind this placid exterior, his inner world was a place of profound stillness. The king's praise, which once would have been a simple, warming honor, now felt different. Each word of trust, each expression of fatherly affection was like a gentle hand pressing down on the secret he carried deep inside him, the memory of the third whisper on the heath. A quiet, invisible distance was opening between him and this good man, a chasm of knowledge that the king, in his innocence, could not see. Duncan then turned to Banquo, embracing him with the same warmth. "Noble Banquo," he said, "that hast no less deserved, and must be known no less to have done so." "There if I grow," Banquo replied with simple sincerity. "The harvest is your own." The king, his heart full, turned back to the assembly. He raised his hands for silence, a gesture that was immediately, gently obeyed. "Sons, kinsmen, thanes," he began, his voice clear and steady. "And you, whose places are the nearest, know this. We will establish our estate upon our eldest, Malcolm." He beckoned to his son, a young man with a serious, gentle face, who came to stand beside him, "whom we name hereafter the Prince of Cumberland." The title was a formal declaration of succession. It was the king's clear and public promise of the future of the crown. The hall erupted in a warm wave of cheers and shouts of "Hail, Prince of Cumberland!" It was a moment of order, of continuity, of a kingdom securing its peaceful future. But for Macbeth, the sound of the celebration was distant, a muffled roar. The king's words had not been a joyful announcement. They were a quiet, final sound, like a heavy wooden bar sliding into place, locking a door. The path that had seemed to be magically clearing before him, the strange mist-shrouded path hinted at by the witches, was now gently but decisively blocked. Young Malcolm, in his modesty and youth, now stood as a great stone on that path. A step, Macbeth thought with a chilling internal clarity, on which I must fall down or else owe a leap, for in my way it lies. The thought was not a shout of rage, it was a cold, quiet whisper of strategic fact. It arose from the deepest, most hidden part of his mind, a place he seldom visited. And as he looked upon the smiling, unsuspecting face of the new Prince of Cumberland, another thought followed, soft and dark as a moth's wing. "Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires." It was a quiet prayer for concealment, a plea for the universe to draw a curtain over the new and terrible landscape that was taking shape within him. King Duncan, blissfully unaware of the silent storm in his general's soul, beamed at the court. His heart was overflowing with gratitude and a desire to bind his kingdom together with personal affection. "From hence to Inverness," he announced, his eyes finding Macbeth's again, "and bind us further to you." He would go to Macbeth's own castle, sleep under his roof, and break bread at his table. It was the highest honor a king could bestow upon a subject, an act of absolute trust. The offer landed in the stillness of Macbeth's mind with profound weight. The king was delivering himself into his home. It was an opportunity so perfect, so unplanned, that it felt less like a coincidence and more like a sign, a silent confirmation from the same strange fate that had whispered his name on the heath. "The rest is labor, which is not used for you," Macbeth said, his voice a marvel of control. "I'll be myself the harbinger and make joyful the hearing of my wife with your approach. So humbly take my leave." He bowed deeply, a long, slow gesture of perfect loyalty. As he turned and walked from the warm, candlelit hall, he could feel the steady, thoughtful gaze of Banquo on his back. He did not look back. He needed the solitude of the road, the cool cloak of the falling night. As he rode away from the cheerful camp, the rhythmic drumming of his horse's hooves on the soft earth was like a countdown. He felt as if he were riding between two worlds, the one he had always known, and another, a quiet, shadowy kingdom of his own making, which he could now almost touch. The king's visit, he knew with a cold and certain dread, was the bridge. To the north, in the stone halls of Inverness Castle, Lady Macbeth stood in the quiet of a withdrawing room, a letter from her husband held in her hands. The air in the room was cool and still, smelling faintly of lavender and old stone. The only sound was the soft crackle of a low fire in the hearth. She read the letter not once but several times, letting the words sink past her eyes and into the deep, calculating part of her mind. He told her everything. He wrote of the strange, dreamlike meeting on the heath, the mist, and the three figures who looked not like the inhabitants of the earth. He recounted their words, their prophecies, one by one, and then he told her of the king's messengers and the astonishing news that the second prophecy, Thane of Cawdor, had already come true, like a seal set upon the witch's words. He called her his dearest partner of greatness, and this phrase, more than any other, resonated within her. It was an acknowledgement of the shared, unspoken ambition that had been the silent core of their marriage for years. She folded the letter slowly, her long fingers creasing the parchment with deliberate care. "Glamis thou art, and Cawdor," she thought, her lips barely moving. The words were not a surprise. They felt like an arrival, the final piece of a puzzle she had long been contemplating. "And shalt be," she continued the thought, a deep and certain calm settling over her, "what thou art promised." She knew her husband. She knew the great heart that beat within the peerless warrior. She respected his strength, his courage in the face of any physical danger, but she also knew his soul. "Yet do I fear thy nature," she mused, her gaze distant, fixed on the slowly dancing flames in the hearth. "It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way." This kindness, she thought, was not a virtue for the task ahead. It was a soft, warm, gentle thing, a quality that would blunt the edge of necessary action. He had the ambition, she knew that. He would desire the crown with a deep and burning want, but he would want to acquire it without fault, to have the glory without the transgression. He would not, she feared, be willing to embrace the illness that must attend such a monumental act. As she stood, lost in this quiet, clinical assessment of her husband's spirit, a servant entered the room. He was breathless from running. "The king," he managed to say, "comes here tonight." Lady Macbeth's head lifted slowly. Her dark eyes, which had been soft with thought, now became sharp and intensely focused. The news was a quiet thunderclap in the still room. The letter had been the whispered suggestion. This news was the opportunity delivered to their very door. It was as if fate, having pointed to the destination, was now holding the gate wide open, inviting them to step through. A deep and powerful calm washed over her, the serene focus of a master artisan seeing the final piece of her great work fall into place. Her husband's gentle, wavering heart would not be their undoing. She would be the fixed point. She would be the iron resolve for them both. She dismissed the servant with a quiet word of thanks and turned her face towards the narrow, stone-framed window. She looked out, not at the courtyard, but at the darkening sky, and she began to speak in a low, steady whisper. It was not a prayer to any god of light. It was a focused invocation, a calling to the ancient, unseen spirits of the world, the ones who thrived in shadow and secrecy. "Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts," she breathed, her voice a hypnotic, rhythmic hum. "Unsex me here." She was not asking for power, but for a removal of what she saw as weakness. She asked them to take away her woman's softness, her natural hesitation, her capacity for remorse. She willed them to fill her, from the crown of her head to the tips of her toes, with a pure and terrible strength. "Come to my woman's breasts," she whispered, "and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers." It was a quiet, terrifying litany of self-transformation. She was methodically, piece by piece, dismantling her own gentle nature and forging in its place a spirit as hard and sharp as a dagger's point. The distant sound of a horn from the outer wall announced her husband's arrival. He entered the chamber looking pale and weary from his hard ride, his mind clearly a battlefield of conflicting thoughts. She went to him, her movements smooth and confident. She took his cold hands in hers, her touch not just warm, but grounding, steadying. "My dearest love," he said, his voice strained. "Glamis thou art and Cawdor," she replied, her voice a low and reassuring murmur, reminding him of the reality, the truth of their new station. "And shalt be what thou art promised." He told her the king was arriving that night. "And when?" she asked, her question soft, precise as a surgeon's cut. "Goes hence." "Tomorrow," he answered, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "As he purposes." A slow, certain smile touched her lips, a smile of profound and chilling serenity. "Oh, never," she whispered, so quietly it was almost a thought, "shall sun that morrow see." She saw the conflict flicker in his eyes, the silent, honorable soldier warring with the new, ambitious king-to-be. She tightened her grip on his hands, her own resolve a tangible force. "Your face, my Thane, is as a book where men may read strange matters," she said, her voice dropping even lower, becoming a soothing, hypnotic counsel. "To beguile the time, look like the time. Bear welcome in your eye, your hand, your tongue." She traced a finger along his jawline, a gesture of seeming tenderness that was also an act of command. "Look like the innocent flower," she whispered, "but be the serpent under it." The image hung in the quiet air between them, a beautiful, welcoming, fragrant bloom, offering a vision of safety and peace, while underneath, hidden in the cool shadows, lay the coiled, secret, and patient danger. "He that's coming must be provided for," she continued, her voice now a blueprint of the deed. "And you shall put this night's great business into my dispatch." She was taking the burden of planning, of logistics, of sin from him. She would be the architect, he merely the instrument. She explained her intent for the king's 2 chamberlains, his guards. She would ply them with wine and wassail, so deeply drugged that memory, the guardian of the brain, would become a mere fog, and their reason a vapor. They would sleep a swinish, deep sleep, a sleep like death itself. He began to voice a protest, to say that they should speak further on it, but she quieted him with a gentle touch and a look of absolute, unwavering certainty. "Only look up clear," she murmured. "To alter favor ever is to fear. Leave all the rest to me." The horns sounded again, closer now, a fanfare announcing the king's arrival at the main gate. Lady Macbeth composed her features into a mask of perfect, gracious welcome. Her bearing became regal, her smile warm and genuine in appearance. She was the model of a loyal and honored hostess. As she swept from the room to greet her king, she was a vision of grace. And as the trusting, gentle King Duncan stepped over the threshold of Inverness Castle, a deep and expectant quiet seemed to fall over the stones themselves, the ancient silence of a place that knows it is about to become a scene of history and of horror. The innocent flower was in full bloom, its petals open in welcome, and underneath, in the cool, patient dark, the serpent waited. The Great Hall of Inverness was a masterpiece of warm deception. The long, heavy tables of dark wood were laden with the best the castle could offer: platters of roasted game, loaves of fresh, warm bread, bowls of autumn fruits, and silver ewers brimming with deep red wine. The air was thick with these comforting scents, mingling with the clean, sharp fragrance of pine branches laid upon the hearths. Dozens of torches were set in their iron brackets along the stone walls, their flames dancing and casting a lively golden light that made the hall feel safe and cheerful, a perfect cocoon against the cool, dark night outside. At the high table, seated in the host's own chair of honor, was King Duncan. The journey had tired him, but his spirit was light. He laughed, a soft, wheezing sound of pure contentment, and spoke with those around him, his words full of praise for the beauty of the castle and the grace of his hostess. He felt utterly secure, wrapped in the loyalty and affection of his worthiest kinsman. He raised his goblet often, toasting his host, his hostess, the victory and the peaceful future of his kingdom. Macbeth sat near him, a still, silent island in this sea of gentle merriment. He was a perfect portrait of a thane, attentive, respectful, his face arranged in a mask of pleasant hospitality. He inclined his head when the king spoke to him, and his lips formed a smile when a smile was required. But his eyes saw nothing of the scene before him. The warm, flickering light, the smiling faces of his fellow lords, the rich tapestries depicting ancient hunts, they were all a distant, meaningless pageant. His own reality was a cold, tight knot of dread that was growing in the pit of his stomach. Every kind word from the king was a soft, sharp jab to his conscience. Every expression of the old man's trust felt like a brand of shame upon his soul. Duncan spoke of loyalty, and Macbeth's mind filled with the image of a bloody knife. The king spoke of the comfort and safety of Inverness, and Macbeth felt a cold draught of sacrilege, as if the very stones of his home were crying out against his secret intention. The cheerful noise of the hall, the gentle laughter, the music from a lone harpist in the corner, it all began to feel like a physical pressure, an unbearable weight. He could not breathe the same air as these unsuspecting men. He could not sit beside the man whose life he was plotting to end. With a murmured word of excuse to his neighbor, he rose from the table, his movements stiff and controlled, and slipped away from the light. He found refuge in the shadows of a stone archway, and then retreated into the deep, cold quiet of a side corridor. Here, the sounds of the feast were a muted, distant roar. The air was still and sharp with the chill that lived perpetually in the castle's stones. He leaned his back against the wall, the cold seeping through the fine wool of his tunic, a welcome, grounding shock to his fevered skin. He was finally alone with his thoughts, and they descended upon him not with a rush, but with a slow, methodical, and terrible clarity. He began to reason with himself, his mind working like a scholar's, examining the proposition from every angle. If it were done when 'tis done, he thought, the words forming silently, precisely, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the murder could be a single, self-contained act, a clean cut severing the present from a future in which he was king, he would risk the judgment of the next life. But he knew, with a warrior's grim understanding of consequence, that it was never so simple. Here, upon this bank and shoal of time, such acts have their earthly consequences. Deeds of violence, he knew, are lessons, and they teach others to be violent in turn. The poisoned chalice we offer to another is, in time, always commended to our own lips. Justice, with an even hand, would eventually serve him the same dark medicine. And beyond this practical fear, there were deeper, more sacred bonds that held his hand. First, he was the king's kinsman. They shared a bloodline, a bond that should make him the king's fiercest protector. Second, he was the king's subject, a duty sworn by a holy oath, an allegiance that was the very bedrock of his honor. To break these bonds was to unmake himself. Then, even more powerfully, he was Duncan's host. The laws of hospitality were ancient and profound. His home was meant to be a sanctuary for his guest. He, Macbeth, should be the one to bar the door against any murderer, not the one to bear the knife himself. To violate this trust was a blasphemy that would stain the very stones of Inverness forever. And then there was Duncan himself, the man. He was not a tyrant whose death could be called a service to the state. The king had been so humble in his great office, his rule so clear and free from corruption, that his virtues would cry out against the deep damnation of his murder. Duncan's goodness was a shield. His gentle spirit would become a rallying cry for vengeance. Pity, like a naked newborn babe, innocent and defenseless, would ride upon the winds, and the tears of the entire kingdom would create a storm of outrage. There would be no quiet acceptance of his reign. There would only be horror. He methodically stripped away every possible justification for the deed, every noble excuse. He was left with nothing. No righteous cause, no answer to a tyrant's oppression, no spur of justice to prick the sides of his intent. There was only one thing, a single, solitary motive, and he saw it for what it was, stark and ugly in the silence of the corridor. Vaulting ambition. That was all. A raw, naked, insatiable hunger for the crown, a hunger that had been awakened by the witches, but which he now knew had been sleeping within him all along. It was an ambition so powerful it threatened to overleap itself, to soar so high it lost sight of all reason, only to fall, broken on the other side. And in that moment of stark self-awareness, he found a strange and hollow peace. He could not do it. He would not. The reasons against it were too great, too sacred. His own honor, his own soul, was worth more than a crown obtained by such a foul and treacherous path. The decision settled in his mind, and he felt a quiet, profound relief, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Why have you left the chamber?" Her voice was low and sharp, cutting through the stillness of the corridor and the new peace in his mind. Lady Macbeth stood at the far end of the passage, a dark silhouette against the distant golden light of the feasting hall. She had come looking for him. Her presence was a silent, powerful reproach. "Hath he asked for me?" Macbeth asked, his voice sounding weak to his own ears. "Know you not he has?" she replied. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her tone was a cold, sharp point. She walked towards him, her steps measured and deliberate, her dark gown rustling softly on the stone floor. She was not the gracious hostess now. She was a general, come to rally a faltering soldier. "We will proceed no further in this business," Macbeth said, and he tried to make his voice firm, to stand on the solid ground of his decision. "He hath honoured me of late, and I have bought golden opinions from all sorts of people, which would be worn now in their newest gloss, not cast aside so soon." He was appealing to reason, to propriety. She stopped directly in front of him, so close he could feel the chilling stillness of her resolve. Her eyes, dark and luminous, searched his, and a look of profound, withering contempt slowly dawned on her face. It was not the hot anger of a frustrated wife, but the cold disappointment of a master craftsman finding a fatal flaw in her chosen instrument. "Was the hope drunk wherein you dressed yourself?" she hissed, her voice a venomous, silken whisper that was more devastating than a shout. "Hath it slept since, and wakes it now to look so green and pale at what it did so freely?" Her words were sharp, clinical barbs, each one designed to pierce his fragile new resolve. "From this time," she continued, her voice dripping with a cold, calculated disdain, "such I account thy love. Art thou afeard to be the same in thine own act and valour as thou art in desire? Wouldst thou have that which thou esteem'st the ornament of life, and live a coward in thine own esteem, letting I dare not wait upon I would, like the poor cat I the adage? Prithee, peace," he implored, the word coward striking him with the force of a physical blow. He, the hero of Scotland, a coward? "I dare do all that may become a man," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "Who dares do more is none." "What beast was it then," she countered, her logic a cold, relentless trap, "that made you break this enterprise to me? When you durst do it, then you were a man." Her voice lowered, becoming intimate, conspiratorial, and deeply cruel. "And to be more than what you were, you would be so much more the man. Nor time nor place did then adhere, and yet you would make both. They have made themselves, and that their fitness now does unmake you." She gestured back towards the hall, towards the sleeping quarters of the king. The perfect time, the perfect place. She leaned even closer, her eyes boring into his, her face a mask of terrible, unwavering focus. She then spoke of something deeply personal, a memory he knew was a shared and painful one, but she used it now as a weapon. "I have given suck, and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me." The image was a shock, a memory of a child they had lost, a past softness now being twisted into a tool of manipulation. "I would," while it was smiling in my face, have plucked my nipple from his boneless gums and dashed the brains out, had I so sworn as you have done to this." Macbeth stared at her, mesmerized by the sheer, inhuman strength of her will. The woman before him was a stranger, a creature forged of pure, unyielding purpose. The milk of human kindness she had accused him of possessing had, in her, curdled into the bitterest gall. He saw his own doubts, his own moral scruples, reflected in her eyes as pathetic weaknesses. His newfound resolve crumbled into dust. A final desperate question escaped his lips, a whisper of his last remaining fear. "If we should fail?" She almost laughed, a short, sharp, contemptuous sound. "We fail?" The very concept was an absurdity to her. "But screw your courage to the sticking place," she commanded, her voice now ringing with the certainty of a blacksmith striking steel, "and will not fail." Her tone shifted then, becoming practical, precise, the plotter laying out her simple, perfect design. She explained how, when Duncan was soundly asleep, she would so overcome his two chamberlains with drugged wine that their memories would become a fog and their reason a mere vapor. They would lie in a swinish, death-like sleep. When in swinish sleep their drenched natures lie as in a death, she concluded, her eyes gleaming. What cannot you and I perform upon the unguarded Duncan? What not put upon his spongy officers who shall bear the guilt of our great quell? He looked into her burning eyes and saw the future she was offering him. The golden round, the sovereign sway, the masterdom. He saw the clear, dark path she had laid out, a path paved with wine and blood and lies. The war within him was over. His ambition, taken by the hand and led by his wife's indomitable will, had triumphed. The horror had not vanished, but it was now a distant, secondary thing, overshadowed by a new, cold determination. He would be the man she demanded him to be. He would be the king he was promised. "Bring forth men children only," he said, his voice a low murmur of awe and utter surrender to her strength. "For thy undaunted metal should compose nothing but males." His mind, now aligned with hers, began to work on the details, adding a layer to her plan. "Will it not be received," he mused, "when we have marked with blood those sleepy two of his own chamber and used their very daggers that they have done't?" "Who dares receive it other?" she replied, a faint triumphant smile touching her lips at last. "As we shall make our griefs and clamour roar upon his death." "I am settled," Macbeth said. The words were quiet, but they were the sound of a great gate closing, a final choice being made. His voice was flat, devoid of the turmoil that had racked him only moments before. "And bend up each corporal agent to this terrible feat." He would marshal every muscle, every nerve, every fibre of his being to this one awful purpose. "Away," he said, his voice now a low command. "And mock the time with fairest show. False face must hide what the false heart doth know." He turned and followed her back towards the great hall, his stride now steady, his face a calm, unreadable mask. The loyal host was returning to his king, and the serpent, coiled and resolute beneath the innocent flower, knew that its time to strike was drawing ever nearer. The great hall of Inverness, once a theatre of warm and lively welcome, was slowly being reclaimed by the night. The long tables, now cleared of their platters and goblets, stood like dark, sleeping beasts in the receding light. Servants moved with soft, tired footsteps, extinguishing the torches one by one, leaving only a few to burn in the main thoroughfares. Each flame they pinched out seemed to draw the shadows in closer, making the hall feel larger, emptier, and infinitely more ancient. The great central hearth, which had roared with cheerful life all evening, now glowed with a core of deep red embers, pulsing softly like a dying heart. The air was growing cooler, heavy with the scents of old stone, and the faint, lingering aroma of snuffed-out beeswax. The castle was settling, sighing its way towards sleep. King Duncan, his heart full and his body weary from the day's long journey and the evening's pleasantries, had been escorted to his chambers. His sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, had retired to theirs, as had the other thanes, their quiet conversations and soft laughter fading down the long stone corridors. A deep and profound stillness began to descend, the specific, heavy silence of a great house that has finally surrendered to the late hour. Macbeth found himself standing in the central courtyard, The air here was cold and clean, a stark contrast to the lingering warmth of the hall. Above, the sky was a vast, starless dome of black velvet, the moon hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds. It was a night without witness, a night that seemed designed for secrets. He had told his wife he would wait for her signal, the sounding of a single bell, which would mean she had drugged the king's chamberlains and the path to Duncan was clear. Now there was nothing to do but wait, and to exist in the echoing silence of his own mind. His thoughts were no longer a raging battle. The decision had been made, the terrible pact with his wife sealed. The conflict had been replaced by a kind of numb, cold clarity, the focus of a soldier before a charge, when fear is not absent but is simply packed away, subordinated to the grim task at hand. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching himself from a great distance, a character in a play whose final bloody act was about to begin. The silence was broken by the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. A torch appeared, its light carving a small, warm circle in the immense dark. It was Banquo, and with him was his young son, Fleance, who carried his father's cloak and sword. "How goes the night, boy?" Banquo's voice was low, and it seemed to carry a weight of weariness that was more of the spirit than the body. "The moon is down, I have not heard the clock," Fleance replied, his own clear voice a small, bright sound in the darkness. "And she goes down at 12, Banquo murmured, looking up at the oppressive, starless sky. "Hold, take my sword," he said, passing the heavy weapon to his son. It was the act of a man preparing for rest, yet his next words belied it. "A heavy summons lies like lead upon me, and yet I would not sleep." He sighed, a deep, troubled sound. "Merciful powers, restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." Macbeth, hidden in the deeper shadows of a buttress, felt a cold prickle of alarm. Cursed thoughts. What thoughts did Banquo fight in the dark of the night? Did he too think of the witches? Did their prophecies haunt his sleep as they now haunted Macbeth's waking hours? "Who's there?" Banquo called out suddenly, his voice sharp with a warrior's instinct, his hand reaching for the sword that was no longer at his belt. "A friend," Macbeth replied, stepping out of the shadows and into the torchlight. "What, sir? Not yet at rest?" Banquo's voice held a note of surprise. "The king's abed. He hath been in unusual pleasure, and sent forth great largesse to your offices." He reached into a pouch at his belt. "This diamond he greets your wife withal, by the name of most kind hostess." He held out the jewel. It caught the torchlight and threw it back in a dozen sharp, brilliant sparks. Macbeth took it. The diamond was cool and heavy in his palm, its sharp facets pressing into his skin. It felt less like a gift and more like a stone of judgment, a final, perfect symbol of the trust he was about to shatter. "Being unprepared," Macbeth said, his voice a carefully constructed mask of neutrality, "our will became the servant to defect, which else should free have wrought." "All's well," Banquo replied easily, but then his tone shifted, becoming lower, more serious, more intimate. "I dreamt last night of the three weird sisters. To you they have showed some truth." The directness of the statement was a quiet shock. Macbeth felt his friend's steady, searching gaze on him in the dark, and he knew his answer must be carefully measured. "I think not of them," he lied, the words feeling clumsy and hollow in his own ears. He tried to steer the conversation onto safer ground. "Yet, when we can entreat an hour to serve, we would spend it in some words upon that business, if you would grant the time." "At your kind's leisure," Banquo agreed, his tone open and honest. Macbeth, emboldened by his friend's lack of overt suspicion, decided to probe the edges of Banquo's loyalty, to float a quiet, veiled offer. "If you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis," he said, his words chosen with immense care, "it shall make honor for you." He was offering a partnership, a share in the greatness that the prophecies had promised, if Banquo would only align himself with him, no questions asked. Banquo's reply was instantaneous, and it was a quiet, unshakable declaration of his own soul's integrity. "So I lose none," he said, his voice calm but firm, "in seeking to augment it, but still keep my bosom franchised and allegiance clear, I shall be counselled." He would accept any honor that came to him cleanly, but he would not sacrifice his loyalty to his king or the clarity of his own conscience to gain it. The line had been drawn, not in anger, but in a simple statement of immutable principle. Banquo could not be bought, he could not be swayed. He stood on the side of right and would not move. The knowledge settled in Macbeth's mind. Banquo would not be an ally in this dark business. He would be an observer, and a man of such integrity who knew of the prophecies would inevitably become a threat. "Good repose the while," Macbeth said, his voice betraying nothing of the cold calculation that had just passed through his mind. "Thanks, sir. The like to you," Banquo replied. He took back his sword from Fleance, and father and son departed, their torchlight shrinking as they crossed the courtyard, their footsteps echoing and then fading into the profound silence. Macbeth was truly alone now, alone with the oppressive, starless sky, the cold stones of his home, and the terrible purpose that was ticking like a clock in his blood. He stood motionless, listening to the frantic, muffled drumming of his own heart, a sound so loud it seemed it must be audible to the whole sleeping castle. And then it came. A bell tolled once. A single, clear, resonant note that cut through the night air, shivering and then fading, leaving a silence that was deeper than before. It was the signal. His wife had done her part. The way was clear. It was time. He began to walk, his feet moving as if of their own accord, taking him from the open courtyard into a long, narrow corridor that led towards the king's apartments. His body moved, but his mind seemed to detach, to fracture from reality. And then he saw it. "Is this a dagger which I see before me, the handle toward my hand?" He stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. Floating in the air before him, about an arm's length away, was a dagger. It hung unsupported, shimmering with a faint, sickly, internal light. It was the shape and size of the dirk he carried at his own belt, a weapon for close, brutal work. It pointed the way he was already going, a spectral, silent guide to murder. He raised a trembling hand, his fingers outstretched to clutch it. He felt nothing but cold air. His hand passed straight through the shimmering image. It was an illusion. "A dagger of the mind," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp in the utter silence. A false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain. It had to be. A hallucination born of his fevered, guilt-ridden state. And yet, it was so vividly real. He could see its sharpened point, the cross-hatching on its hilt, the small pommel stone. He drew his own dagger from its sheath. The real one was dark, solid, heavy in his hand. He held it up beside the phantom, comparing the tangible steel to the ethereal, hovering blade. As he watched, the vision began to change. On its blade and handle, great drops of blood appeared, thick and dark red, that had not been there before. The phantom dagger was now showing him the future, the bloody consequence of the act he was about to commit. "It is the bloody business which informs thus to mine eyes," he reasoned, his mind clinging desperately to logic, to sanity. He understood now. The world around him was warping, the very air becoming thin, the stones beneath his feet seeming to listen. The night itself was an accomplice. Across half the world, nature seemed dead. Wicked dreams abused the sleeping. Witchcraft celebrated its pale-eyed queen, and withered murder, roused by his wolfish howl, moved now with a ghost's stealthy pace towards his design. He felt a terrible kinship with these dark things. He was becoming one of them. He was no longer just Macbeth. He was the murderer. The spectral dagger faded, dissolving into the gloom as silently as it had appeared. He was left alone in the dark corridor, his own solid, heavy dagger clutched in his fist. The bell had been the invitation. This vision was the confirmation. The world of spirits and the world of men were aligned in this single, dark purpose. "I go, and it is done," he said, the words a vow to himself, a final push to set his feet in motion. "The bell invites me." He began to walk again, his steps now eerily silent on the stone flags. He addressed the sleeping king in a final, terrible whisper. "Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell." He reached the heavy oak door of the king's bedchamber. It was, as his wife had promised, unlatched. He pushed it open. The hinges, well oiled, made no sound. He slipped inside. The room was vast and filled with deep shadows. A single candle, left burning on a chest, provided the only light. its flame guttering and casting long dancing shapes upon the tapestried walls. He saw them first, the two chamberlains. They were slumped in heavy chairs on either side of the door, their heads lolling on their chests. Their mouths were slack, their breathing a low, guttural snore. On a small table between them sat an empty wine flagon and two silver cups. Their own daggers lay beside the flagon, easily within reach. They were sleeping a sleep so deep it was a perfect counterfeit of death. His gaze moved from the guards to the great curtained bed that dominated the room. A soft, rhythmic snoring, the peaceful sound of a man in deep and untroubled repose, came from within its velvet depths. It was the sound of a man who felt safe, the sound of a man who would never wake again. Macbeth moved across the room, his feet seeming to float above the floor. He felt weightless, unreal. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs, but the rest of him was cold and numb. Every fiber of his being, every lesson of honor and loyalty he had ever learned, screamed at him to turn back, to flee this terrible, silent room. But the image of his wife's face, her eyes blazing with contemptuous fire, pushed him forward. The memory of the prophecy, the promise of the golden round, pulled him forward. He reached the bed. He put out a trembling hand and slowly, silently parted the heavy velvet curtains. There he was. In the faint, flickering candlelight, King Duncan lay asleep. His silver hair, thin and fine, was spread like a halo on the white linen of the pillow. His face, in the vulnerability of sleep, looked impossibly old and gentle. His mouth was slightly agape, and a small, peaceful sigh escaped his lips. He was utterly, completely defenseless, a trusting child in a dark room. This was the moment, the precipice of his soul. Macbeth raised the dagger high, the polished steel catching a faint gleam from the candle. For a single, eternal second, he hesitated. The blade quivered in his hand. A torrent of images flashed through his mind. The king's warm embrace in the hall, the sincere joy in his eyes, the heavy weight of the diamond he had sent to his wife, a lifetime of loyalty and service. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. His wife's voice, his wife's will. He closed his eyes. He shut out the sight of the old, sleeping face, and he struck. He did not see the wound. He felt it through the handle of the dagger, a hideous, yielding softness, then the sickening, grating crunch as the blade struck bone. A wet, choked gurgle came from the bed, a brief, spastic stiffening of the old man's limbs, and then a new kind of silence, a final, absolute silence that swallowed all other sound. It was done. The act was done. In the vast, echoing silence that followed the final soft exhalation of the king, time itself seemed to stop. Macbeth stood frozen over the bed, his arms still raised, the dagger clutched in a grip of white-knuckled intensity. The weapon felt impossibly heavy, as if it contained the entire weight of the kingdom, the entire weight of his own soul. He did not breathe, he did not think. He was a statue of his own crime, listening to the new and terrible quiet of the room. The only sound was a soft, rhythmic dripping, a thick, slow tear of liquid striking the linen sheets, a sound that would echo in his mind for all the nights to come. Slowly, as if waking from a long, deep trance, he lowered his arm. His eyes, which he had squeezed shut at the final moment, opened. He forced himself to look. The flickering candlelight was mercifully dim. It softened the horror, turning it into a kind of awful painting. He saw the peaceful, silvered hair of the old king, now threaded with streaks of deep, dark crimson. He saw the fine linen of the pillows, once a pure and snowy white, now blossoming with a terrible, spreading flower of red. The phrase came to his mind, unbidden, from some poet's verse, a silver skin laced with a golden blood. The description was so beautiful and the reality so profane that a wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. This was not the abstract concept of regicide. This was a violation, a rent in the fabric of the world. He took a stumbling step back from the bed, his boots making a soft, scraping sound on the stone floor that seemed as loud as a thunderclap. The silence rushed back in, and with it, an awareness of his own body. He could hear his own breathing, a ragged, desperate rasp for air. He could hear his heart, a frantic, muffled drumbeat against his ribs, so loud, so powerful that he was certain it must be audible not just in this room, but throughout the entire sleeping castle. It was the sound of his own life, a frantic, guilty thing, beating on in a room where the most sacred life had just been extinguished. He stared at his hands. They did not look like his own. They were coated in the warm, sticky, rapidly cooling lifeblood of his king. They were the hands of a stranger, a butcher. He held them up in the wavering candlelight, turning them over and over, mesmerized by the sheer, shocking redness of them. This stain was not just on his skin. He felt it seeping deeper through his flesh, into his very bones. A soft sound from the corner of the room made him freeze, his blood turning to ice. One of the drugged chamberlains, lost in the depths of his unnatural sleep, stirred and mumbled a single slurred word: murder. The word, though thick and dream-laden, struck Macbeth with the force of a physical blow. He was discovered. It was over, but the guard only shifted in his chair and fell silent again. The other guard then sighed in his sleep, a soft, plaintive sound. "God bless us," he whispered into his wine-soaked dreams. The two simple words, a common prayer against the terrors of the night, pierced Macbeth's soul more deeply than any sword. He had heard their prayer, and he, who had more need of blessing than any man on earth, found that he could not form a response. He tried to whisper, "Amen." The word was there, in his mind, but it would not come. It was a physical obstruction, a shard of glass lodged in his throat. The holiest of words, the word of acceptance and hope, was now a foreign language to him. He had cut himself off from grace, severed the connection with a single brutal thrust of a blade, and then he heard the voice. It was not the guards, it was not a sound from the corridor, it was a voice that bloomed from the silence itself, a clear, calm, and terrible whisper that spoke not to his ears, but inside the very dome of his skull. It was a thought that was not his own. "Sleep no more," it said, with a dreadful, passionless clarity. "Macbeth does murder sleep." He looked wildly around the room, his eyes darting into the deep shadows. There was no one there, but the voice continued, a slow, inexorable pronouncement of his sentence. It spoke of sleep, the innocent sleep, the sleep that, it whispered, knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the gentle mending of a frayed and worn-out day, the death of each day's life, the quiet end to toil and worry. It called sleep sore labor's bath, the cleansing water for an aching body. It was the balm of hurt minds, the soft healing ointment for a wounded spirit. It was great nature's second course, the nourishing feast that restores the soul. And the voice, this calm internal judge, told him he had murdered it. He had murdered rest. He had murdered peace. Still it cried, "Sleep no more," to all the house, the voice continued, its resonance filling his mind. "Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more." The finality of it was absolute. It was not a threat, it was a statement of fact. His punishment would not be a swift execution, but an eternity of wakefulness, an endless, sleepless turning in the dark, with nothing for company but the memory of this single, silent, candlelit moment. A wave of pure, animal terror finally broke through his numbness. He had to get out. He turned and stumbled from the room, bumping into a heavy wooden chest, his movements clumsy, his limbs refusing to obey him. He fled down the dark corridor, the bloody daggers still clutched in his hands, their purpose, their part in the plan, utterly forgotten. He found his wife in the antechamber where he had left her. She was standing perfectly still, a statue of patience carved from the night, her face pale in the faint moonlight filtering through a high window, but her eyes were alight with a fierce, burning intensity. She was listening, not for him, but for any sound of alarm from the castle. "My husband!" she breathed, a note of sharp relief in her voice as she saw him. "I have done the deed," he whispered, his voice a ragged, broken croak. He felt a tremor run through his entire body. "Didst thou not hear a noise?" "I heard the owls scream and the crickets cry," she replied dismissively, her senses attuned to the normal, natural sounds of the night. "Did not you speak? When? Now? As I descended? Aye." He held up his hands, presenting them to her as if they were evidence of his own damnation. This is a sorry sight. A foolish thought to say a sorry sight, she chided him, her tone sharp, impatient. But then her eyes fell upon the daggers, and her composure hardened. "Why did you bring these daggers from the place?" she demanded, her voice a low, angry hiss. "They must lie there. Go carry them, and smear the sleepy grooms with blood." Macbeth shook his head, a violent, trembling motion. He shrank back from the dark doorway of the king's chamber, as if it were the mouth of hell itself. "I'll go no more," he said, his voice pleading. "I am afraid to think what I have done. Look on't again I dare not." He had seen the face of his own crime, and the image was now burned behind his eyes. He could not, would not, face it again. "Infirm of purpose," she hissed, her contempt a palpable force in the cold air. "Give me the daggers." She did not wait for him to obey. She snatched them from his unresisting grasp. "The sleeping and the dead are but as pictures," she said, her voice a chilling lesson in ruthless practicality. "'Tis the eye of childhood that fears a painted devil. If he do bleed, I'll gild the faces of the grooms withal, for it must seem their guilt." Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the blackness of the king's chamber, leaving him alone with his guilt and his blood-stained hands. He stared at them, lost in a new and terrifying vision. The stain was so deep, so absolute. "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" he murmured to the silent stones. The thought was a desperate, childish hope, and the answer came back from the depths of his own ruined soul. No. The image flooded his mind, vast and vivid. "This my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red." He saw it, the endless green expanse of the ocean, the whole world of water, turning a sick, uniform crimson, tainted forever by the small, foul stain on his single hand. His wife returned, as silent as a ghost. Her own hands were now as red as his, but where he saw damnation, she saw only a task completed. She looked at his horrified face, and then at her own gory hands, and she held them up, a mirror to his own. "My hands are of your color," she said, her voice a low, steady statement of fact. "But I shame to wear a heart so white." She called his horror a weakness, his conscience a pale and cowardly thing. She moved towards a small basin of water set in an alcove. "A little water clears us of this deed," she said, with a frightening, simple confidence. "How easy is it then?" She dipped her hands into the cool water, and as she began to wash, a new sound entered their sealed and secret world. Thud. It was not a sharp rap, but a deep, heavy, resonant boom that seemed to come from far away, from the outer gates of the castle. It was a sound of immense weight and authority. It was solid. It was real. Thud. It came again, closer this time, it seemed. A slow, deliberate, and inexorable summons. It was the sound of the outside world, the world of daylight and order and consequences, knocking at the door of their bloody, private hell. Lady Macbeth froze, the water dripping from her crimson-stained hands. Her easy confidence evaporated in an instant. "Hark! More knocking," she whispered, a new sharp note of fear in her voice. She grabbed his arm, her touch now frantic. "Get on your nightgown, lest occasion call us and show us to be watchers. Be not lost so poorly in your thoughts." But Macbeth was lost. He was staring at the unseeable gate, listening to the sound that was the tolling of his own doom. "To know my deed," he murmured, his voice hollow, a lament for his own lost self. "'Twere best not know myself." Thud, thud, thud. The knocking was faster now, more insistent, a terrible urgency. Someone wanted in. "Wake Duncan with thy knocking," Macbeth whispered, his voice a choked, desperate, and utterly hopeless prayer. "I would thou couldst." The knocking was a rude and unwelcome intrusion. Deep within the castle, in a small windowless chamber near the kitchens, the porter was trying to sleep. He lay on a thin straw mattress, still wrapped in the warm, fuzzy blanket of a long night's drinking, his head filled with a dull, pleasant buzzing. The knocking, when it first began, was a distant, ignorable thud, a mere annoyance that he tried to incorporate into a drunken dream. But it was persistent. It grew louder, more insistent, a heavy, rhythmic booming that seemed to shake the very stones around him. It was the sound of duty calling, and he groaned. "Here's a knocking indeed," he grumbled to the darkness, his voice a thick, froggy croak. He sat up slowly, his head pounding in time with the blows on the gate. He was in no hurry. Let them wait. Let them feel the chill of the morning. He chuckled to himself, a low, rumbling sound. In his slow-moving, wine-addled brain, a grim and amusing fantasy began to take shape. If a man were porter of Hellgate, he slurred to the empty room, he should have old turning the key. Thud, thud, thud. The knocking was impatient now. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? In the name of Beelzebub, he called out to his imaginary visitors. He pictured a farmer, his face twisted with greed, who had hoarded his grain expecting a famine, only to find a season of plenty. A man who, in his disappointment, had hanged himself. "Come in, farmer," the porter cackled. "Have napkins enow about you. Here you'll sweat for it." Thud, thud, knock, knock. "Who's there? In the other devil's name," he continued, thoroughly enjoying his role as the gatekeeper to damnation. He imagined an equivocator, a man who could twist words and swear on both sides of an argument, a man who had committed treason for what he thought was God's sake, yet could not talk his way into heaven. "Oh, come in, equivocator. We have a special place for you." Slowly, groaning with the effort, he got to his feet. He picked up his lantern, its candle stub burning low, and began the long, shuffling walk across the main courtyard towards the great south gate. The air was cold and sharp, and the pale, grey light of dawn was just beginning to seep over the eastern wall, turning the sky from black to a soft, bruised purple. The knocking had finally stopped, replaced by an expectant silence. He reached the gate and with a great, grunting effort, drew back the 3 heavy iron bolts. They slid open with a screech of protesting metal. He heaved the massive oak door inward and squinted at the 2 figures standing there, their forms dark against the growing light. They were cloaked and booted for travel, their breath pluming in the frigid air. It was Macbeth, the Thane of Fife, and with him, the young Thane of Lennox. Macduff's face was stern, his expression impatient and all business. "Was it so late, friend, ere you went to bed, that you do lie so late?" Macduff asked, his voice clipped and sharp, with no patience for the porter's tardiness. "Faith, sir, we were carousing till the second cock," the porter replied, with a gravelly chuckle, unoffended by the Thane's sharp tone. He stood aside, holding his lantern high, and led them into the quiet, sleeping courtyard. As they reached the centre of the yard, another figure emerged from the shadows of the main keep. It was Macbeth. He was dressed now in his nightgown, a simple woolen robe, his hair slightly dishevelled, as if he had just been roused from sleep. His face, in the pale dawn light, was a carefully composed mask of weary hospitality. There was no trace of the frantic, blood-stained man who had stood on this very spot only moments before. "Good morrow, both," he said, his voice calm and even. "Is the king stirring, worthy Thane?" Macduff asked, getting straight to the point. His duty was to the king, not to pleasantries. "Not yet," Macbeth replied smoothly. "He did command me to call timely on him," Macduff stated. "I have almost slipped the hour." "I'll bring you to him," Macbeth said. The words were simple, the offer gracious, but for him it was a moment of immense, silent tension. He was about to lead this man, this direct and observant Thane, to the very door of his crime. He turned and led the way, his steps measured and unhurried, across the cold flagstones towards the guest wing, the wing where the king slept. Lennox followed a few paces behind, looking around the courtyard with a sense of unease. "The night has been unruly," Lennox commented to Macbeth, his voice low. The young Thane was clearly unsettled. "Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down, and, as they say, lamentings heard i' the air, strange screams of death." He shook his head, his eyes wide. "And prophesying with accents terrible of dire combustion and confused events new-hatched to the woeful time. The obscure bird clamoured the live-long night. Some say the earth was feverous and did shake." "'Twas a rough night," Macbeth agreed, his understatement a masterpiece of control. He kept his face impassive, his gaze fixed on the door ahead. They reached the king's chamber. "This is the door," Macbeth said, stopping. "I'll make so bold to call," Macduff said, his sense of duty overriding any further ceremony, "for 'tis my limited service." He gave Macbeth a short, formal nod, then turned and entered the king's room, disappearing into the darkness within. Macbeth and Lennox were left waiting in the corridor. The silence stretched. Macbeth could feel the younger Thane's nervous energy, but he himself remained perfectly still, a statue of waiting. He was listening, not for Macduff's voice, but for the inevitable sound of discovery, the cry that would signal the beginning of the next terrible act of this play. It came. It was not a shout of greeting. It was a strangled, horrified gasp, followed by a cry that was ripped from the very depths of Macduff's soul. "Oh, horror, horror, horror! Tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee!" The door to the chamber was flung open with such force that it crashed against the stone wall. Macduff stood there, framed in the doorway, his face a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. He was trembling, his hands held up as if to ward off the sight he had just witnessed. "What's the matter?" Macbeth and Lennox cried in near unison, their performance of surprise perfectly timed. "Confusion now hath made his masterpiece," Macduff wailed, his words tumbling out in a torrent of disbelief. "Most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple, and stole thence the life of the building." "What is't you say? The life?" Macbeth pressed, feigning confusion. "Mean you his majesty?" Lennox asked, his voice shaking with genuine fear. "Approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new gorgon," Macduff urged them, gesturing wildly at the dark room behind him. "Do not bid me speak. See, and then speak yourselves." As Macbeth and Lennox, their faces masks of grim concern, rushed past him into the chamber, Macduff turned and ran to the center of the courtyard. He filled his lungs and let out a great, terrible roar that shattered the morning quiet, a sound of pure alarm. "Awake! Awake! Ring the alarum bell! Murder and treason! Banquo and Donalbain! Malcolm! Awake!" His voice was a physical force, a clarion call of disaster. "Shake off this downy sleep, death's counterfeit, and look on death itself. Up, up, and see the great doom's image." In response to his cries, a frantic, clanging peal of alarm began to ring from the bell tower. Not a single summoning note this time, but a chaotic, terrifying jangle that spoke of fire and invasion. The sound ripped through the sleeping castle. Doors were thrown open. Half-dressed servants and soldiers poured into the courtyard, their faces pale and bewildered, their eyes wide with sleep and confusion. Lady Macbeth appeared, wrapped in a fine cloak, her expression one of feminine fright and confusion. "What's the business?" she cried out over the din of the bell. "That such a hideous trumpet calls to parley the sleepers of the house? Speak, speak!" "O gentle lady," Macduff said, turning to her, his own face wrought with anguish, "'tis not for you to hear what I can speak. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell." Just then, Banquo arrived, a sword in his hand, his face hard and alert. "Oh, Banquo, Banquo!" Macduff cried, turning to his fellow soldier. "Our royal master's murdered." Lady Macbeth let out a gasp, a perfect, sharp intake of breath. She put a hand to her heart, her eyes wide with shock. "Woe, alas!" she cried. "What, in our house?" "Too cruel anywhere," Banquo replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. His eyes were not on Macduff, they were hard and searching, and they were fixed on the pale, composed face of his host, Macbeth, who now emerged from the king's chamber with Lennox at his side. Macbeth's face was a study in theatrical sorrow. He seemed to be looking at something far away, his eyes filled with a poet's tragic vision. "Had I but died an hour before this chance," he announced, his voice ringing with a deep, mournful quality, "I had lived a blessed time, for from this instant there's nothing serious in mortality. All is but toys, renown and grace is dead, the wine of life is drawn, and the mere lees is left this vault to brag of." His speech was beautiful. It was heartfelt. It was, perhaps, a touch too perfect. At that moment, the king's sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, arrived, their faces young and frightened. "What is amiss?" Malcolm asked, his voice trembling. "You are, and do not know it," Macduff told him, his tone blunt with grief. "The spring, the head, a fountain of your blood is stopped. The very source of it is stopped. Your royal father's murdered," Macduff stated plainly. The two princes stared, their shock so profound it stole the very breath from their lungs. "Oh, by whom?" It was Lennox who asked the question that hung in the air. Macbeth stepped forward, taking control of the narrative. "Those of his chamber, as it seemed, had done it," he announced, his voice firm, authoritative. "Their hands and faces were all badged with blood, so were their daggers, which unwiped we found upon their pillows." He shook his head in feigned disbelief. They stared and were distracted. No man's life was to be trusted with them. He paused, taking a breath, letting the image of the guilty, blood-soaked guards sink into the minds of the horrified onlookers. Then he delivered the final, calculated stroke of his plan. "Oh, yet I do repent me of my fury," he said, his voice now filled with a rough, passionate emotion, "that I did kill them." The statement landed with the force of a second shockwave. Macduff whirled on him, his eyes blazing with suspicion. "Wherefore did you so?" The question was an accusation, an act of summary justice, without trial, without question. It was a breach of all law. Macbeth's reply was a torrent of feigned passion, a masterful performance of a loyal man overcome by righteous rage. Who can be wise, amazed, temperate and furious, loyal and neutral in a moment? No man, he cried, his voice soaring. The expedition of my violent love outran the pauser, reason. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture for them. Here lay Duncan, his silver skin laced with his golden blood, and his gashed stabs looked like a breach in nature for ruin's wasteful entrance. There, he pointed back to the chamber, the murderers steeped in the colours of their trade, their daggers unmannily breached with gore. Who could refrain, he demanded of the silent, staring crowd, that had a heart to love, and in that heart, courage to make love known. He had done it. He had silenced the only possible witnesses. He had explained their deaths with a motive no one could dare question, his overwhelming love for his murdered king. He had sealed the story. The blame was fixed, the loose ends tied. It was at that precise moment, as Macbeth's passionate words still hung in the cold morning air, that Lady Macbeth let out a low moan and her eyes rolled back in her head. "Help me hence, ho!" she cried weakly, and began to sway, her body slumping as if in a faint. It was a perfect diversion. The tension of Macduff's question was broken as several thanes, including Macduff himself, rushed to her side, their concern for the gentle lady overriding all else. As they attended to her, the court dissolved into a chaos of murmuring, confused groups. But in the midst of this turmoil, Malcolm and Donalbain stood apart, their youthful faces suddenly aged with a cold, clear understanding. The shock had passed, and in its place was a chilling fear. "Why do we hold our tongues?" Malcolm whispered urgently to his brother, "that most may claim this argument for hours." This was their tragedy, yet they were silent spectators. "What should be spoken here?" Donalbain replied, his voice a low, tense murmur, his eyes darting from one thane's face to another. "Where our fate, hid in an auger hole, may rush and seize us. Let's away. Our tears are not yet brewed." They could not afford to show their grief here. This was no place for sorrow. It was a place of danger. "Nor our strong sorrow upon the foot of motion," Malcolm agreed. They knew, with the instinct of hunted animals, that the murderer was still among them, his face hidden behind a mask of sorrow or concern. They saw the truth with terrible clarity. There were daggers in men's smiles, and the nearer they were in blood to the murdered king, the nearer they were to being murdered themselves. While Banquo tried to bring order to the chaos, calling for the thanes to dress and meet in the hall to investigate this most bloody piece of work, the two princes made their own desperate plan in hushed, urgent whispers. Isle to England, Malcolm decided. It was a seat of power, a place to seek aid. "To Ireland I," said Donalbain. "Our separated fortune shall keep us both the safer. Where we are, there's daggers in men's smiles." They would not wait. They would not ask for leave. To do so would be to put themselves in the hands of the very man they suspected. In the confusion, they slipped away, finding their horses and melting into the grey morning, their silent flight a desperate act of self-preservation. But they knew it would be seen by others as an admission of guilt, a final, damning piece of evidence that would clear the path to the throne of Scotland for its new, self-made and blood-soaked claimant. The day that followed the murder of King Duncan was a day without a sun. A profound and unnatural gloom had settled over the kingdom. A heavy, brooding darkness that felt less like weather and more like a physical manifestation of grief. The sky, which at this hour should have been a pale and hopeful blue, was instead a thick, seamless blanket of cloud, the colour of a deep and spreading bruise. It was a sunless noon, a twilight at midday, and the world beneath it seemed to have been muted. A deep and watchful stillness held the fields and forests in its grip. The birds, whose chorus should have greeted the dawn, were unnervingly silent, their nests quiet in the unnaturally dark trees. The wind itself, the the constant sighing companion of the Scottish Highlands, had died completely, leaving the air stagnant and heavy. It was as if the whole of nature, from the smallest finch to the great arch of the sky, was holding its breath, shocked into a state of silent protest by the sacrilegious act that had taken place in the heart of the realm. On a muddy track just beyond the imposing stone gates of Inverness Castle, two men met. One was Ross, the Thane, who, in what now felt like another lifetime, had so joyfully delivered the news of Macbeth's new title. His face, usually open and cheerful, was today drawn and grey with a weary, soul-deep sadness. The other was a nameless old man, a tenant farmer from the castle lands, whose long life had been spent reading the seasons and the sky. His face was a testament to his years, a rich map of wrinkles and deep-set lines, and his eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp with a fearful, profound wonder. He leaned heavily on a staff of polished, gnarled blackthorn, his gaze turned upwards towards the oppressive, dark canopy of the sky. 70 I can remember well, the old man began, his voice a low, gravelly murmur that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He spoke slowly, as if retrieving memories from a great distance, within the volume of which time I have seen hours dreadful and things strange. He had seen blizzards that had buried cottages, floods that had turned valleys into lakes, and eclipses that had frightened the cattle. But this sore night, he continued, shaking his head with a slow, deliberate motion, hath trifled former knowings. This one night, this long, terrible, and bloody night that had just passed, had made all the other strange and dreadful events of his 70 years on earth seem like mere children's ghost stories. Ross, his own heart heavy with a sense of dread that went beyond simple grief, nodded in grim agreement. "Ha, good father," he sighed, the words a plume of white in the cold, damp air. "Thou seest the heavens, as troubled with man's act, threaten his bloody stage." It was clear to him, too. The sky was not merely dark, it was an active participant in the tragedy. It was a divine frown, a celestial judgment on the terrible deeds of men below. He pointed a gloved finger towards the shrouded heavens. "By the clock 'tis day, and yet dark night strangles the travelling lamp. Is it night's predominance or the day's shame that darkness does the face of earth entomb when living light should kiss it?" The question hung in the still air. Was the darkness a victory of the night? Or was the day itself so ashamed of what had happened on the earth below that it refused to show its face? "'Tis unnatural," the old man whispered, the words seeming to hold all the fear and confusion of the moment, "even like the deed that's done." He lowered his gaze from the sky and looked at Ross, his old eyes filled with a chilling light. He had seen another omen, a smaller but no less terrible sign of the world's imbalance. "On Tuesday last," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, awestruck tone, "a falcon, towering in her pride of place, was by a mousing owl hawked at and killed." He paused, letting the impossible image form in Ross's mind. A falcon, the very embodiment of nobility and grace, the queen of the daytime sky, soaring at the pinnacle of her flight, was struck down. And not by an eagle, not by a worthy rival, but by a lowly owl, a creature of the night, a hunter of mice and voles, a bird that should have been roosting in a dark barn. It was a profound and terrifying inversion of the natural order, a perfect and dreadful metaphor for a great and noble king being struck down in his sleep by a lesser, baser subject who belonged to the darkness. Ross listened, and a cold shudder ran through him. The old man's tale resonated with a frightening harmony to another story he had just heard from the castle stables. "And Duncan's horses," he said, his voice low and hushed with disbelief. "A thing most strange and certain." He described them, beauteous and swift, the minions of their race, perfect in form and spirit. They were the finest horses in all of Scotland, symbols of the king's grace and power. "Turned wild in nature," he continued, "broke their stalls, flung out, contending 'gainst obedience as they would make war with mankind. These creatures of discipline and breeding had been seized by a sudden, inexplicable madness." "'Tis said," the old man interjected, his eyes wide, "they eat each other." "They did so," Ross confirmed, the memory still fresh and horrifying. to the amazement of mine eyes that looked upon't. The king's own horses, these noble animals, had become cannibals, their wild grief and the unnatural energy of the night turning them against their own kind. The world, it seemed, was not merely out of joint. It was tearing itself apart, its very fabric unraveling from the highest heavens to the humblest stable. Their quiet, fearful conversation was interrupted by the sound of firm, purposeful footsteps on the road. It was Macbeth, the Thane of Fife, emerging from the deep shadow of the castle gate. He was fully dressed for a long journey, his heavy cloak fastened at the shoulder with a simple silver brooch. His expression was grim and closed, his jaw set, and his eyes, which were usually full of a direct and honest fire, now held a cold, hard, and watchful light. He looked like a man who had made a difficult decision and would not be moved from it. "How goes the world, sir, now?" Ross asked him, his voice holding a desperate need for some solid fact, some piece of real news to anchor him in this swirling fog of omens and portents. "Why, see you not?" Macbeth replied, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. He did not need to elaborate. He simply gestured with his chin at the dark, troubled world around them. "Is't known who did this more than bloody deed?" Ross pressed, hoping for clarity, for a single, believable villain to blame for the chaos. Macduff's answer was a stark and simple statement of the official story, the narrative that was now being carefully constructed and disseminated from the halls of Inverness. "Those that Macbeth hath slain," he said, "the two dead chamberlains, the convenient culprits." "Alas the day!" Ross lamented, shaking his head. "What good could they pretend? What could they possibly have gained? What was their motive?" "They were suborned," Macbeth stated. The word means bribed or induced to commit a crime, and his tone was laced with a fine, sharp, and bitter irony. He then provided the next piece of the official story. Malcolm and Donalbain, the king's two sons, are stolen away and fled, which puts upon them the suspicion of the deed. The logic was almost insultingly simple. The princes, hungry for the crown, had hired the guards to kill their father. Then, either stricken by guilt or fearing that their conspiracy would be discovered, they had fled the country. It was a neat, tidy story, a story that answered all the immediate questions, a story that Macduff, it was clear from the cold contempt in his voice, did not for a single moment believe. Ross, however, was a more pragmatic man. Perhaps he did not fully believe it either, but he saw the political reality it created. "'Gainst nature still," he lamented, shaking his head at the thought of sons murdering the father who gave them life. "It was just another piece of the world's madness. Thriftless ambition that will raven up thine own life's means." He followed the logic to its inevitable conclusion. "Then 'tis most like the sovereignty will fall upon Macbeth." With the good king dead and his natural heirs fled and publicly disgraced, the path was clear. Macbeth, the hero of the victory against Norway, the king's own valiant kinsman, was the obvious, the necessary, the logical successor. "He is already named," Macduff confirmed, his voice colder than the morning air, "and gone to Scone to be invested." Scone. The very name was sacred. It was the ancient, hallowed ground where Scottish kings had been crowned for generations, the site of the legendary Stone of Destiny. The final, formal step was already being taken. The hurried, unseemly business of succession was being rushed to its conclusion. The stolen crown was being placed upon the murderer's head. "Where is Duncan's body?" Ross asked, his voice softening, his thoughts turning from the grim politics of the living to the sad duty owed to the dead. "Carried to Colmkill," Macduff replied, "the sacred storehouse of his predecessors and guardian of their bones. The gentle king's body was on its way to the holy island of Iona to be laid to rest among the long line of his royal ancestors." "Will you to Scone?" Ross asked his friend, a question of political allegiance. "No, cousin, I'll to Fife," Macduff said, his tone final and absolute. The decision was a quiet but profound act of political and personal defiance. He would not travel to Scone. He would not participate in the ceremony. He would not witness the coronation of a man he suspected of the most foul of crimes. He would not bend his knee. He would go home, to his own castle, his own lands, to wait and to watch. It was a silent, powerful protest, a refusal to sanction what he knew in his bones was a foul and stolen kingship. It was the first small crack in the new king's authority. "Well, I will thither," Ross said with a sigh. He was a man who understood the necessity of order, even an order born of chaos. He would go. He would witness the event. He would work within the new reality, however troubling it might be, for the good of the kingdom. "Well, may you see things well done there," Macduff said, and his words were a prayer laced with the deepest doubt. He looked at Ross, a long, meaningful look. "Adieu," he said softly, "lest our old robes sit easier than our new." His meaning was clear. He feared that the old days under the good and lawful King Duncan, which they had all taken for granted, would prove to be far more comfortable, far safer than the new era that was dawning under King Macbeth. With a final, grim nod to both men, he turned and began his solitary journey home, a powerful, brooding figure walking away from the new center of power. The old man watched him go, then turned his ancient, weary gaze back to Ross. "God's benison go with you," he said, his voice a soft prayer, "and with those that would make good of bad and friends of foes." It was a blessing for a broken world, a world where everything had been turned upside down, where right and wrong had become dangerously, terrifyingly blurred. As Ross turned his own horse towards the road to Scone, to the coronation, and to the beginning of the new reign, the unnatural darkness over the land showed no sign of lifting. Macbeth had what he wanted. He had murdered for it, and his wife had schemed for it, and the flight of the princes had sealed his good fortune. He was to be king. But the crown he was about to receive, waiting for him on its cushion of velvet at Scone, was not a symbol of divine right and noble succession. It was a cold, heavy and stolen thing, haunted by the ghost of a good king and stained with invisible blood. And the kingdom he was about to rule was not a land of peace and loyalty, but a land plunged into a fearful, watching twilight. A kingdom that knew, in its very soil, that something was deeply and terribly wrong. The throne had been won, but the price, the quiet, creeping, spiritual price, was only just beginning to be paid. The great hall of the royal palace at Forres, which had so recently been a place of gentle fellowship under King Duncan, was now a place of formal, watchful ceremony. The air itself felt different. The warm, easy camaraderie had been replaced by a stiff and careful courtliness. The thanes and ladies of Scotland moved with a new and cautious grace, their conversations lower, their laughter less frequent and more subdued. They were all dressed in their finest robes, a vibrant and colourful assembly, but beneath the silks and velvets there was a palpable tension, a shared, unspoken awareness that they were all actors in a new and uncertain play. At the centre of it all, upon the high-backed throne of Scotland, sat King Macbeth. He wore the crown, a heavy circle of gold that seemed to press down on his brow. He wore the royal robes, their rich ermine trim a stark white against the deep purple fabric. He looked every inch the king. His posture was erect, his expression composed. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and authoritative. He was performing the part of a confident and rightful monarch flawlessly, but behind the calm facade of his eyes, a restless and troubled energy churned. The peace he had hoped the crown would bring him was nowhere to be found. The throne was not a place of rest, but a new and more terrible battlefield, and his enemies were no longer foreign soldiers, but the phantoms of his own mind. His wife, Queen Macbeth, sat on a smaller, though no less ornate, throne beside him. She too played her part to perfection. She was the picture of regal grace, her smile serene, her gestures calm and measured. She was the steadying presence at his side, the anchor for his new and fragile kingship. But a quiet weariness was beginning to settle deep within her, a faint shadow behind the brilliance of her eyes. The terrible strength she had summoned on the night of the murder had been a borrowed thing, and the cost of it was beginning to come due. The court was preparing for a great feast that evening, a solemn banquet to celebrate the new reign. Macbeth, the gracious king, addressed the assembled court. His words were smooth and well rehearsed. "You know your own degrees. Sit down," he commanded, a gesture of familiarity that was also a reminder of the strict order of his new court. At first and last, the hearty welcome. He announced that he and his queen would mingle with their guests, playing the humble host and hostess. But before the feast began, he turned his attention to one man in particular, a man who stood quietly at the edge of the assembled thanes. It was Banquo. "Here's our chief guest," Macbeth announced, his voice booming with a false and hearty friendship. Lady Macbeth rose and added her own warm greeting. "If he had been forgotten," she said with a brilliant smile, "it had been as a gap in our great feast and all thing unbecoming." Banquo bowed his head, his expression unreadable. He had been a constant, quiet presence at the new court, performing his duties with his usual diligence, but there was a new distance in his eyes, a thoughtful reserve that Macbeth found deeply unsettling. "Tonight we hold a solemn supper, sir," Macbeth said, his tone now casual, probing, "and I'll request your presence." "Let your highness command upon me," Banquo replied, his words perfectly loyal, "to the which my duties are with a most indissoluble tie forever knit." "Ride you this afternoon?" Macbeth asked. The question was light, conversational, but it was laden with a sharp and specific purpose. "Aye, my good lord," Banquo confirmed. "We should have else desired your good advice," Macbeth continued, "which still hath been both grave and prosperous in this day's council, but will take tomorrow. Is it far you ride?" "As far, my lord, as will fill up the time twixt this and supper," Banquo answered, still guarded. "Go not my horse the better, I must become a borrower of the night for a dark hour or twain." Macbeth's smile did not waver. "Fail not our feast." "My lord, I will not." Another question, even more specific, even more pointed. "Goes Fleance with you?" "Aye, my good lord," Banquo said. "Our time does call upon's." He bowed once more to the king and queen, then turned and left the hall, a strong, solitary figure walking away from the glitter and tension of the court. Macbeth watched him go, and for a moment, the mask of the genial king slipped. A shadow of cold, hard calculation passed across his face before he turned back to his other lords. "I'll come to you anon," he said, dismissing them to their own conversations. "I am for you till 7 at night. To make society the sweeter welcome, we will keep ourselves till supper time alone." With a final, regal nod, he dismissed the entire court. The thanes and ladies bowed and began to disperse, their quiet talk filling the hall as they departed, leaving Macbeth alone on his throne, alone with his thoughts. And his thoughts were a nest of venomous snakes. He rose from the throne and began to pace the empty hall, his footsteps echoing on the stone floor. The crown had brought him no peace, no security. It had only sharpened his fears, giving them a new and terrifying focus. And that focus was Banquo. To be thus is nothing, he thought, his mind racing, but to be safely thus. To be king was meaningless if he was not secure in his kingship. And his fear of Banquo was a deep and constant ache in his soul. It was not just that Banquo was a brave and valiant soldier. Macbeth had many such men around him. No, his fear was rooted in something deeper. It was Banquo's royalty of nature, his quiet, unshakable integrity, the effortless nobility of his spirit. It was a quality that made Macbeth feel small and base in comparison. Banquo was a man who dared much, but who also had a wisdom that guided his valor, keeping him safe. In his presence, Macbeth felt his own genius was rebuked, as Mark Antony's was said to be by Caesar. And then there was the prophecy, the most terrible thorn of all. The witches had hailed him as king, and that had come true. But they had not promised the crown to his children. They had hailed Banquo as the father of a line of kings. The prophecy that had been a spur to his own ambition now became a source of constant, gnawing torment. Upon my head they placed a fruitless crown, he thought with a surge of bitter rage, and put a barren scepter in my gripe, thence to be wrenched with an unlineal hand, no son of mine succeeding. The realization was a poison in his blood. He had done the deed. He had murdered the gracious Duncan, defiled his own soul, and shattered his peace of mind for eternity. And for what? For Banquo's sons, for Banquo's issue. He had damned himself to hell only to place a crown on the head of another man's descendants. The injustice of it was a physical pain. Rather than let that happen, he would challenge fate itself. He would fight the prophecy, he would fight the future, he would fight to the death. His mind was made up. The same cold, practical logic that had led him to Duncan's bedchamber now led him to his next bloody decision. Banquo and his son, Fleance, had to be removed. It was not a matter of anger, but of cold, hard political necessity. He summoned a servant. "Are those men waiting?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "They are, my lord, without the palace gate," the servant replied. "Bring them before us," Macbeth commanded. The servant bowed and scurried away, leaving Macbeth alone again for a moment. He was no longer the conflicted, tormented man who had seen visions of daggers. That man had died with Duncan. This was a new Macbeth, a king who had embraced the darkness, a tyrant who would now use murder not as a single, desperate act to gain a throne, but as a routine instrument of policy to keep it. The servant returned, followed by two men. They were not courtiers, they were rough men, their faces hard, their eyes narrowed and wary. They were men whose lives had been hard scrabble and filled with disappointment, their cloaks threadbare, their hands calloused. They were men with grievances against the world, men who felt that the old order under Duncan had dealt them an unfair hand. They were, in short, men who could be bought. Macbeth dismissed the servant and turned his cold, calculating gaze upon the two murderers. He began to speak to them, his voice a low, persuasive and poisonous whisper. He reminded them of a previous conversation, how he had convinced them that it was not he, but Banquo, who had been the secret cause of all their past misfortunes, the reason for their poverty and their fall from grace. He had loaded all their resentments, all their bitterness onto Banquo's shoulders. "No," he said, his voice a silken thread of manipulation, "that it was he, in the times past, which held you so under fortune, which you thought had been our innocent self." He had painted himself as their friend, and Banquo as their hidden enemy. He questioned their manhood, their patience, their willingness to let such an enemy live. He worked on their pride, their anger, their desperation, molding them like clay. He told them that he had need of their service, a service that would not only earn them his eternal gratitude and reward, but would also rid them of the man he had taught them to hate. It was a task that required a special kind of man, a man free from the burdensome weight of conscience. The two men, their eyes now gleaming with a mixture of greed and a desire for revenge, assured him that they were those men. Their lives were so hard, so filled with struggle, that they would risk anything to make them better or to end them. "Your spirits shine through you," Macbeth said with grim approval. The deal was struck. He gave them their instructions. The murder must be done that night at some distance from the palace, and it must be absolute. Both Banquo and his son, Fleance, for the boy was just as dangerous, must be dealt with. The work must be clean, with no loose ends. "It is concluded," Macbeth said, his voice a flat, final command. "Banquo, thy soul's flight, if it find heaven, must find it out tonight." The two murderers bowed and slipped away, melting back into the shadows from which they had come. Macbeth stood alone in the great hall, the setting sun casting long, blood-red fingers of light through the high windows. He was king, he was secure, he had taken control of his own fate. But the silence that descended upon the hall was not the silence of peace. It was the cold, empty silence of a man who was now truly and utterly alone, a man whose only companions were his fears, and whose only solution was the spilling of more and more innocent blood. The afternoon sun, which had been a stranger all day, finally managed to pierce the thick veil of clouds as it began its slow descent towards the horizon. It did not shine with a warm golden light, but with a watery, pale luminescence that seemed to have no heat, casting long, distorted shadows across the landscape. It was in this strange, ethereal light that Banquo and his son, Fleance, rode their horses along a quiet, wooded path. They were on their way back to the palace at Forres, making their way towards the king's great feast. They had spent the afternoon riding, a welcome respite from the stiff formality and watchful quiet of Macbeth's new court. Out here, among the ancient trees and the whispering grasses, the air felt cleaner, more honest. Banquo rode in a thoughtful silence, his brow furrowed, his gaze distant. The events of the past weeks churned in his mind, a ceaseless and troubling tide. He thought of the three strange figures on the heath, their whispered prophecies that had seemed like a madman's fantasy, but which had come true for Macbeth with a chilling, unnatural speed. Glamis, Corder, and now King. It had all happened just as they had said, and a deep, cold suspicion, a thought he barely dared to form even in the privacy of his own mind, had taken root. "Thou hast it now," he thought, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. King, Cawdor, Glamis, all as the weird women promised. And then the darker thought followed, the one that kept him from sleeping soundly at night. "And I fear thou playedst most foully for it." The suspicion was a heavy weight on his soul. Macbeth was his friend, his comrade in arms, a man with whom he had stood back to back in the chaos of a dozen battles. But the Macbeth who now sat on the throne was a different man. There was a new stillness in him, a guarded quality, a coldness behind the mask of hearty friendship. Banquo could feel it, and it frightened him. Yet, a small, selfish flicker of hope, a thought he was ashamed of, also found its way into his heart. If the prophecies had come true for Macbeth, why not for him as well? The witches had promised that he himself would not be a king, but that he would be the father to a line of kings. He looked at his son, Fleance, who rode beside him, his youthful face open and untroubled. He saw the boy's strength, his quiet grace. Could it be true? Could this child, this good and gentle boy, be the start of a royal dynasty? The thought was a tempting, warming whisper, but he pushed it away. It felt dangerous, a seed of the same ambition that he feared had already consumed his friend. He resolved to keep his counsel, to watch, to wait, and to hold his own honor fast. "Look, father," Fleance said, his clear voice breaking the silence. He pointed towards the west. "The sun is almost down. We should make haste if we are to be on time for the supper." "You are right, my son," Banquo replied, shaking himself from his reverie. He urged his horse into a gentle trot. "We would not want to be late for the king's feast." As they entered a stretch of the path that was more densely wooded, where the twilight was already gathering in deep pools of shadow, a man stepped out from behind a great oak tree. He was a stranger, his face rough and weather-beaten. Banquo reined in his horse, his hand instinctively moving to the hilt of his sword. "Who are you, friend?" he called out, his voice calm but wary. Before the man could answer, two more figures emerged from the gloom on the other side of the path, effectively blocking their way forward and back. There were three of them, the murderers Macbeth had hired. They had been waiting, patient as spiders, for their prey to walk into their web. In that instant, Banquo understood everything. The king's casual questions about his ride, about the distance, about whether Fleance would be with him. It all clicked into place with a sickening, horrifying clarity. This was no random robbery. This was an execution. "Oh, treachery!" he cried out, not in fear for himself, but in a great, heartbroken wave of sorrow for his friend, for the man Macbeth had once been. He drew his sword, a flash of silver in the dying light. "Fly, good Fleance, fly, fly, fly," he yelled, his voice a desperate, commanding roar. "Thou mayst revenge, O slave!" He spurred his horse forward, charging at the man in front of him, trying to break through the trap and clear a path for his son. But the other two converged on him from the sides. A heavy blow struck him in the back, a searing pain that stole his breath. He swayed in the saddle, but his warrior's instinct kept him upright. He swung his sword in a great, desperate arc, forcing the men to fall back for a moment. In that brief, precious instant, Fleance did as his father commanded. He was a boy, but he was a brave boy. He wrenched his horse's head around and spurred it, not back down the path, but directly into the dark, tangled woods. The horse, panicked, crashed through the undergrowth, branches whipping at the young rider's face. One of the murderers started to go after him, but the first called him back. "Who did strike out the light?" he yelled. In the scuffle, someone had knocked over their lantern, and the small pool of light they had been relying on was extinguished. The woods were now plunged into a deep and confusing darkness. "Let's make an end of the father," the third man growled. "The son is fled." Their attention turned back to Banquo. He had fallen from his horse now, wounded but still fighting, a great, lion-hearted man at bay. But he was 1 against 3, and the first blow had been a deep one. He fought with the last of his strength, but it was not enough. They closed in around him in the darkness, and their blades fell. A few moments later, all was quiet on the wooded path. The three murderers stood over Banquo's still form, their chests heaving from the effort. "He's dead," the first one said. "The son is fled," the second repeated, a note of worry in his voice. "We have lost best half of our affair," the third grumbled. They had succeeded in their main task, but the boy, the seed of the prophecy, had escaped. They knew the king would not be entirely pleased. With a final, nervous look around the dark and silent woods, they dragged Banquo's body into the ditch, and then hurried away, melting back into the shadows to make their report at the palace. The only sound left was the gentle sighing of the wind, which had finally begun to stir in the trees. The last of the twilight faded, and a deep, starless night fell, blanketing the scene of the quiet, brutal murder. Back at the palace in Forres, the great hall was aglow. The banquet was in full swing. Hundreds of candles burned in their sconces, their light reflecting in the polished silver plates and the fine crystal goblets. The long tables were laden with an extravagant feast, a magnificent display of the new king's power and generosity. The air was filled with the sounds of music, conversation, and polite laughter. King Macbeth and his queen moved among their guests, the perfect hosts. Macbeth was charming, attentive, full of warm words and hearty smiles. He spoke with this thane, shared a jest with that one, and raised his cup in salute to their loyalty. But his easy manner was a performance of immense effort. His mind was not on the feast. His senses were stretched, listening, waiting. He was watching the main door of the hall, waiting for his messengers of death to arrive. As he was speaking with a group of lords near the entrance, he saw him. One of the murderers had appeared at the doorway, a dark figure lingering just outside the bright circle of the hall. The man caught his eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "There's blood upon thy face," Macbeth said in a low, urgent whisper as he moved towards him, his own face still wreathed in a public smile. "'Tis Banquo's then," the murderer replied, his voice a gravelly murmur. "'Tis better thee without than he within," Macbeth said with grim satisfaction. "Is he dispatched?" "My lord, his throat is cut. That I did for him." "Thou art the best of the cutthroats," Macbeth breathed, a wave of profound relief washing over him. "Yet he's good that did the like for Fleance. If thou didst it, thou art the nonpareil." The murderer's face fell. "Most royal sir," he stammered, "Fleance is scaped." The relief that had flooded through Macbeth turned instantly to ice. "Then comes my fit again," he whispered, his voice tight with a sudden, returning dread. The serpent he thought he had killed was only scotched, not dead. It would heal and be as venomous as ever. The boy lived. The prophecy lived. "But Banquo's safe?" he asked, grasping for the one piece of good news. "Aye, my good lord," the murderer confirmed. "Safe in a ditch he bides, with 20 trenched gashes on his head, the least a death to nature." The image was a comfort. The father, at least, was dealt with. "Thanks for that," Macbeth murmured. He would deal with the escaped son later. For now he had a feast to attend to, a part to play. "Get thee gone," he commanded. "Tomorrow we'll hear ourselves again." The murderer bowed and disappeared. Macbeth turned back to the feast, composing his face back into the mask of the genial host. He walked towards the high table, where his queen and the other high-ranking thanes were seated. "My royal lord, you do not give the cheer," Lady Macbeth called to him, her voice a gentle, public chiding. "The feast is sold that is not often vouched, while 'tis a-making, 'tis given with welcome." "Sweet remembrancer," Macbeth replied, his smile broad and false. "Now good digestion, weight on appetite, and health on both." "May't please your highness sit," Lennox said, gesturing to the empty seat at the head of the table, the king's own place. Macbeth looked at the throne-like chair, and he saw that it was not empty. Sitting in his place was a figure. It was Banquo. Or rather, it was the ghost of Banquo. His skin was deathly pale, his hair matted with blood and dirt from the ditch where he lay. His eyes were not living eyes. They were hollow, dark, and held a deep, sorrowful, and soul-piercing accusation. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply sat there, his head shaking slowly, a gesture of profound and silent reproach. "Here had we now our country's honour roofed," Macbeth said, his voice strained, his eyes fixed on the terrifying apparition, "were the graced person of our Banquo present." He was trying to pretend, to speak as if he saw nothing. "His absence, sir," Ross said, oblivious, "lays blame upon his promise. Please it your highness to grace us with your royal company." "The table's full," Macbeth stammered, his gaze still locked on the silent, bloody figure. "Here is a place reserved, sir," Lennox said, pointing to the empty chair. "Where?" Macbeth cried, his voice rising in panic. Lennox, confused, pointed again. "Here, my good lord. What is it that moves your highness?" Macbeth had forgotten his guests. He had forgotten his crown. He was a man alone in a room with a ghost. "Which of you have done this?" he demanded, his voice a choked whisper, his eyes sweeping across the bewildered faces of his thanes. "What, my good lord?" they asked, utterly baffled. "Thou canst not say I did it," Macbeth shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the empty chair where only he could see the gory spectre. "Never shake thy gory locks at me." The feast came to a halt. A shocked, fearful silence fell over the hall. The thanes stared at their king, who was now yelling at an empty chair, his face a mask of pure terror. "Gentlemen, rise, His Highness is not well," Ross said, his voice full of alarm. But Lady Macbeth was on her feet in an instant, her voice sharp and commanding, taking control of the disastrous scene. "Sit, worthy friends," she ordered them. "My lord is often thus, and hath been from his youth. Pray you, keep seat. The fit is momentary. Upon a thought he will again be well." She moved to her husband's side, her face a mask of calm concern for the benefit of their guests, but her eyes were blazing with a cold fury. "Are you a man?" she hissed at him under her breath, her voice a low, venomous lash. "Aye, and a bold one, that dare look on that which might appall the devil," he whispered back, his eyes still fixed on the ghost. "Oh, proper stuff," she mocked him in a furious undertone. "This is the very painting of your fear. This is the air-drawn dagger which you said led you to Duncan." She dismissed his terror as a woman's fancy, a childish ghost story told by a fire. "Shame itself. Why do you make such faces? When all's done, you look but on a stool." Her words seemed to break the spell. Macbeth looked again, and the chair was empty. The ghost was gone. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to regain his composure. He turned back to his guests, forcing a weak, trembling smile. "I have a strange infirmity, which is nothing to those that know me," he explained, his voice shaky. "Come, love and health to all, then I'll sit down. Give me some wine, fill full." He raised a goblet. "I drink to the general joy of the whole table, and to our dear friend Banquo, whom we miss. Would he were here." And as he spoke the name, the ghost reappeared, more vivid, more terrible than before. It took its seat, its hollow eyes fixed upon him. Macbeth screamed, a raw, unkingly sound of pure terror. He dropped the goblet, its contents splashing like blood on the stone floor. "Avaunt, and quit my sight! Let the earth hide thee!" he shrieked at the empty chair. "Thy bones are marrowless, thy blood is cold. Thou hast no speculation in those eyes which thou dost glare with." The hall was in an uproar. The guests were on their feet, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They thought their king had gone utterly mad. Lady Macbeth knew the evening was lost. Her attempts to control the situation had failed. "I pray you, speak not," she said to the horrified thanes, her voice strained but still commanding. "He grows worse and worse. Question enrages him. At once, good night. Stand not upon the order of your going, but go at once." Lennox, Ross, and the other lords, deeply disturbed and frightened by what they had witnessed, needed no further encouragement. They fled the hall, their departure a chaotic and undignified scramble, their minds filled with a new and terrible suspicion about their strange and unstable king. They left Macbeth and his wife alone in the vast, brightly lit hall, a sea of overturned goblets and abandoned food around them. The ghost was gone. The silence it left behind was heavy with the weight of ruin. Macbeth stood, trembling, his fine royal robes seeming like a costume on a frightened child. "It will have blood, they say," he murmured, his eyes wide and vacant. "Blood will have blood." The old proverb was now a terrifying reality. The stones would speak, the trees would move, the secrets would not stay buried. "You have displaced the mirth, broke the good meeting, with most admired disorder," his wife said, her voice flat and exhausted, all the fire gone out of her. "What is the night?" he asked, his sense of time, of reality, completely shattered. "Almost at odds with morning. Which is which?" she replied wearily. He looked at her, his mind already moving on, latching onto a new fear, a new name. "How sayest thou that Macduff denies his person at our great bidding?" Macduff had not come to the feast. It was another act of defiance, another crack in his authority. He saw betrayal everywhere. "Did you send to him, sir?" she asked, too tired to even feign interest. "I hear it, by the way, but I will send," he said, his voice growing stronger, harder. A new, cold resolve was settling in. The fear was still there, but it was now transforming into a kind of grim, bloody-minded determination. He would stop hesitating. He would stop being half a villain. He would embrace the darkness completely. "I will tomorrow," he announced, his voice low and resolute. "And betimes I will to the weird sisters. More shall they speak, for now I am bent to know by the worst means the worst." He would seek out the witches again. He had to know what was coming. He had to know his fate. He looked at his wife, but he was not really seeing her. He was seeing the path ahead, a river of blood that he had to cross. "I am in blood," he said, his voice a quiet statement of fact. "Stepped in so far that, should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er." He had come too far to turn back now. The only way forward was through more violence, more death. The strange, new and frightening things in his head, he decided, he would act upon before he even had time to think about them. "You lack the season of all nature's sleep," his wife said, her voice a monotone of exhaustion. It was the only comfort, the only remedy she could offer. "Come," he said, taking her arm, his touch mechanical. "We'll to sleep." They walked out of the ruined banquet hall, two small figures in a vast, empty room, leaving the remnants of their failed celebration behind them. But Macbeth knew with a dreadful certainty that the sleep his wife spoke of would not come for him. He had murdered it, and now he would have to learn to live without it, alone in the long, dark and watchful night of his own making. The great feast at Forres was over, its memory a ruin of spilled wine and panicked flight. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of deep and chilling isolation. For Macbeth, the ghost of Banquo had been more than a terrifying hallucination. It was a confirmation. It was proof that the world of consequence was real and that it would not leave him be. The fear that had coiled in his heart was now transforming, hardening into a cold, grim, and bloody-minded resolve. If the world was to be a place of horrors, then he would become the greatest horror within it. He would no longer be a man reacting to fear. He would be a man who acted first, who purged his fears with blood before they could take spectral shape. His first act in this new, hardened state was a journey into darkness. He knew he had to return to the source, to the strange, whispering figures who had set him on this path. He had to know more. He had to know the worst. And so he travelled to a place of ill repute, a dark and hidden cave set amongst a jumble of black, moss-slicked rocks, far from any honest dwelling. The air at the cave's mouth was cold and foul, thick with the smell of decay and strange, bitter herbs. Inside, a great cauldron bubbled over a sickly, unholy fire, its contents a thick and troubling stew. Around it stood the three weird sisters, their withered forms silhouetted against the lurid coloured flames. They were chanting, their voices a dry, rustling chorus, adding foul ingredients to their brew. A poisoned toad, the eye of a newt, the tongue of a dog, the finger of a birth-strangled babe. They were not merely brewing a potion, they were weaving a spell, concentrating all the world's malice into the bubbling pot. When Macbeth strode into their cave, his face set like a stone mask, they did not seem surprised. They greeted him not as a man, but as a kindred spirit. "By the pricking of my thumbs," the second sister rasped, "something wicked this way comes." "How now, you secret black and midnight hags?" Macbeth demanded, his voice ringing with a new and kingly arrogance. "What is't you do?" "A deed without a name," they replied in unison. He did not care for their riddles. He was here for answers, and he would have them, even if it meant the whole world was plunged into chaos. He commanded them to speak, to show him what the future held. They obeyed. From the steaming cauldron, apparitions began to rise, spectral forms shaped from the foul brew and the dark magic of the cave. The first was the image of a head encased in a soldier's helmet. Its voice was hollow, seeming to come from far away. "Macbeth, Macbeth, Macbeth," it warned. "Beware Macduff. Beware the Thane of Fife." The warning was stark and direct, confirming the suspicion that had already taken root in Macbeth's own mind. The second apparition was more strange. It was the form of a newborn child, yet its skin was covered in blood. Its voice was high and clear. "Be bloody, bold, and resolute," it chimed. "Laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth." A great wave of exhilaration swept through Macbeth. None of woman born. Every man was born of a woman. The prophecy was a shield, a guarantee of invincibility. If only Macduff could be harmed by a man not born of a woman, then he had nothing to fear from him. And yet, the first warning still echoed. To be safe, doubly safe, he would have Macduff killed anyway. He would take a bond of fate and make assurance doubly sure. Then, a third apparition arose. It was the form of a child again, but this one was crowned, and in its hand it held a small tree, a sapling. "Be lion-mettled proud," it announced, "and take no care who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are. Macbeth shall never vanquished be until great Burnham Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him." Macbeth almost laughed aloud. A moving forest. The prophecy was an impossibility, a guarantee of a long and prosperous reign. A forest could not uproot itself and march up a hill. He was safe, he was invincible, he was eternal. But one more question burned in his mind, the old, nagging torment. "Shall Banquo's issue ever reign in this kingdom?" he demanded. The sisters warned him to seek no more, but he insisted, and so they showed him one final vision. A procession of 8 kings, all of them bearing a resemblance to his murdered friend Banquo. The last king in the line held a mirror, and in it were reflected many more, stretching out into the future. And beside them, smiling, was the bloody spectral form of Banquo himself, pointing to them as his descendants. The vision confirmed his deepest fear. His bloody work had all been for them. A searing, impotent rage filled him. But before he could cry out, the witches, their cauldron, and their apparitions all vanished, leaving him alone in the cold, stinking cave, with the echoes of their deceptive prophecies ringing in his ears. He emerged from the cave into the grey light of day, his heart a strange and volatile mixture of godlike confidence and bitter fury. As he was mounting his horse, Lennox arrived with news. Macduff, the Thane of Fife, had fled. He had gone to England. The news was the spark that lit the fire of Macbeth's rage. He had hesitated, and his enemy had escaped. No more. From this moment on, he vowed, the very firstlings of his heart would be the firstlings of his hand. He would no longer pause to think or to reason. His thoughts would become deeds in the same instant. "The castle of Macduff I will surprise," he announced to Lennox, his voice cold and flat. "Seize upon Fife, give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and all unfortunate souls that trace him in his line." It was a new kind of evil. This was not a murder for ambition or even for security. It was an act of pure, spiteful, and terrifying rage. It was the lashing out of a tyrant meant to send a message of blood and terror across the whole of Scotland. While Macbeth was embracing his own darkness, a very different scene was unfolding in the gentle light of the English court. Here, in a quiet garden, Malcolm, the rightful heir to the Scottish throne, met with the fugitive Thane, Macduff. Malcolm was cautious, his heart having been taught a bitter lesson in trust. He feared that Macduff might be a secret agent of Macbeth's, sent to lure him back to Scotland and to his death. And so, he began to test him. He painted a picture of himself as a man utterly unfit to be king. He claimed to be filled with a lust so deep and insatiable that all the women of Scotland would not be enough to satisfy him. But Macduff, his own heart pure, dismissed this. Scotland had willing dames enough, he said. Such a vice was bearable when weighed against so many other graces. Malcolm then claimed a deeper, more terrible flaw. He said he was possessed by a stanchless avarice, a greed so profound that, were he king, he would strip the nobles of their lands, steal their jewels, and invent false quarrels just to seize their wealth. Macduff, though troubled, still tried to find a balance. This vice was worse, he admitted, but Scotland had wealth enough to satisfy a king's greed. Finally, Malcolm delivered his final, damning confession. He claimed to have none of the virtues that befit a king. No justice, no verity, no temperance, no mercy, no patience, no courage. He claimed to be a cesspool of every sin, a man who, if he had power, would pour the sweet milk of concord into hell, uproar the universal peace, and confound all unity on earth. At this, Macduff finally broke. His hope for Scotland, which he had pinned on this young prince, was utterly extinguished. He cried out in a great, sorrowful voice, "Oh, Scotland, Scotland!" He could no longer bear it. "Fit to govern, no, not to live," he lamented. "Oh, my poor country!" He announced that he would leave this place and never return to the land he loved, for it was doomed. And in Macduff's honest, heartfelt despair, Malcolm finally saw the truth. He saw that this was no agent of Macbeth, but a true and passionate patriot. His test was over. Macduff, this noble passion, child of integrity, hath from my soul wiped the black scruples, Malcolm said, his voice now clear and strong. He took back all the lies he had told, confessing that he was, in fact, none of those things. He was a virgin, had never coveted another's goods, and delighted in truth. He had only been testing Macduff's loyalty. He then gave him the good news. Old Siward, the great English general, was ready with an army of 10,000 men to march on Scotland and reclaim the throne. Their cause was not hopeless. An army of liberation was ready. As they were rejoicing in this new alliance, a doctor passed by, speaking of the good English King Edward, a man so holy that he could cure sickness with his touch. It was a stark contrast to the sickness that now gripped the throne of Scotland. Their quiet moment was then interrupted by the arrival of another thane from their homeland. It was Ross, his face a mask of grief. He spoke of the terrible state of Scotland, a land that was no longer their mother but their grave. A land where sighs and groans and shrieks that rent the air were made, and no one even noticed. He tried to hold back his most terrible news, but Macduff, seeing the sorrow in his kinsman's eyes, pressed him. "What's the newest grief?" Ross, his voice choked with emotion, finally told him. "Your castle is surprised," he said softly. "Your wife and babes savagely slaughtered." The words did not seem to land at first. Macduff stood in a state of profound, silent shock. He pulled his hat down over his brow, trying to hide the sudden, overwhelming wave of grief. "My children too?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Wife, children, servants, all that could be found," Ross confirmed, weeping now himself. The grief hit Macduff like a physical blow. He lamented that he had not been there, that this had happened because of his own flight. He tried to process the horror. "All my pretty ones," he whispered to himself. "Did you say all? Oh, hell kite, all? What, all my pretty chickens and their dam at one fell swoop?" Malcolm, seeing his friend's raw anguish, tried to give it a purpose. "Dispute it like a man," he urged. "I shall do so," Macduff replied, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "But I must also feel it as a man. I cannot but remember such things that were most precious to me." He let the full, agonizing weight of his loss wash over him. But then, as the tears fell, a new and terrible fire began to burn in his eyes. The profound, heartbreaking sorrow began to cool, to harden into a single, cold, and diamond-hard purpose. "Gentle heavens," he said, his voice now steady and full of a chilling resolve, "cut short all intermission. Front to front bring thou this fiend of Scotland and myself. Within my sword's length set him. If he scape, heaven forgive him too." His personal grief had been forged into a weapon. He was no longer just a patriot fighting for his country. He was now an instrument of divine and personal vengeance. The rebellion had found its heart, and the army, with this terrible new purpose driving it, began its long march north, towards Dunsinane and towards the tyrant king who waited there, surrounded by his fears and his false prophecies. While the armies of liberation marched north, the castle at Dunsinane had become a fortress of fear. The stone walls, once a symbol of Scottish strength, were now a prison for a king who trusted no one. Macbeth, haunted by his ghosts and driven by his bloody certainties, had become a tyrant in full. His spies were in every noble's house. His moods were volatile and violent. The thanes who had not fled his rule now served him not out of loyalty, but out of a cold, paralytic terror. The very air of Scotland seemed to groan under the weight of his oppressive reign. And in the deepest, quietest chambers of the castle, another tragedy was playing out its final, sorrowful act. Lady Macbeth, the iron-willed woman who had once called upon the spirits to unsex her, who had scorned her husband's fear and washed the king's blood from her hands as if it were a common stain, was now utterly broken. The fierce strength she had summoned had been a poison, and it had worked its way into the deepest corners of her soul, corroding her from the inside out. Her waiting gentlewoman, her loyal servant, had sought out the castle's doctor, her face etched with a deep and worried concern. For several nights, she told him, the queen had been rising from her bed, with her eyes wide open as if she were awake. She would unlock her closet, take out a piece of paper, fold it, write upon it, and then seal it, all while in the most profound and heavy sleep. The doctor was skeptical, but agreed to watch with the gentlewoman that night, and as they stood in the shadows of a dark, cold corridor, they saw her. Lady Macbeth emerged from her bedchamber, holding a single candle. She was dressed in her white nightgown, her long dark hair unbound around her shoulders. Her eyes were open, but their sense was shut. They saw nothing of the world around them. She was seeing something else entirely. She set the candle down carefully and then began to rub her hands together, a frantic, compulsive scrubbing motion, as if trying to wash away a stain that only she could see. "Yet here's a spot," she murmured, her voice a low, haunted whisper that was a world away from the commanding tones she had once used. The doctor and the gentlewoman watched, frozen in a mixture of pity and awe. "Out, damned spot! Out, I say!" she whispered fiercely to her own hand. "1, 2, why then, 'tis time to do't." She was reliving the night of Duncan's murder, her mind trapped in an endless, looping nightmare of the bell that had been the signal. "Hell is murky," she muttered. Then her tone shifted, becoming a strange echo of her chiding words to her husband. "Fie, my lord, fie, a soldier, and afeard? What need we fear who knows it, when none can call our power to account?" But the bravado was fleeting, the guilt was stronger. Yet who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? She asked the empty air, her voice filled with a child's bewildered horror. Her mind then jumped to another crime, another stain. "The Thane of Fife had a wife," she murmured. "Where is she now?" A new wave of frantic scrubbing began. "What, will these hands ne'er be clean?" She then seemed to be speaking to her husband again, her voice full of the old impatience. "No more of that, my lord, no more of that. You mar all with this starting." She lifted her hands to her face, sniffing them. "Here's the smell of the blood still," she moaned, a soft, heartbreaking sound. "All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Oh, oh, oh." It was a confession, a complete and terrible catalogue of their crimes, poured out from the depths of her broken soul. The doctor listened, his face grim. This was a sickness beyond his practice. This was a disease of the mind, a malady of a soul in torment. He knew there was no earthly cure for what ailed her. "More needs she the divine than the physician," he murmured to the gentlewoman. He could only advise them to remove from her any means by which she might harm herself, and to watch her, to watch and to pray. Lady Macbeth, her terrible pantomime finished, took up her candle and drifted back to her bedchamber, leaving behind a silence thick with the knowledge of her guilt and the tragedy of her undoing. The iron will had rusted and shattered, and all that was left was this fragile, sleepwalking ghost, forever washing her hands in the dark. Meanwhile, Macbeth was in the main hall of the castle, arming for a battle he still believed he could not lose. He had received the news. The English army, 10,000 strong, was approaching, led by Malcolm, Seward and Macduff. And worse, they were being joined by a flood of Scottish thanes, Lennox, Ross, Angus and many others who were deserting his cause to join the side of the rightful king. He was being abandoned, but he clung to the witch's prophecies as a drowning man clings to a piece of wreckage. "Bring me no more reports," he roared at a terrified servant. "Let them fly all, till Burnham Wood remove to Dunsinane I cannot taint with fear." He scoffed at the young, untried Malcolm. Was he not born of woman? He was. Then he had nothing to fear. Macbeth's confidence was a brittle, fragile thing, a desperate bravado that barely concealed the deep, sick-hearted weariness beneath. He knew, in a quiet part of his soul that he tried to ignore, that his life was falling into ruin. His way of life, he mused, was fallen into the sere, the yellow leaf. And that which should accompany old age, as honor, love, obedience, troops of friends, he must not look to have. In their place, he had only curses, not loud but deep, and a hollow, false praise he had to force from his subjects. A servant entered with the news of his wife's final illness, but Macbeth dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "Cure her of that," he commanded the doctor. "Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow?" But he knew, even as he asked, that such a cure was impossible. He put on his armor, its familiar weight a small comfort, a reminder of the warrior he had once been. He was ready for the siege, he was ready for the fight. "I will not be afraid of death and bane," he declared, "till Burnham Forest come to Dunsinane." Outside the castle walls, the allied forces of Scotland and England met near Burnham Wood. They were a great and determined army, united in their cause to heal their wounded country. It was there that Malcolm gave a simple but brilliant command. "Let every soldier hew him down a bough," he ordered, "and bear it before him. Thereby shall we shadow the numbers of our host, and make discovery err in report of us." And so the army began to move. 10,000 men, each one holding a leafy green branch before him, advancing on Dunsinane. From a distance, it did not look like an army of men. It looked for all the world like a forest, walking. Inside the castle, the first blow to Macbeth's deluded confidence fell. As he was directing his few remaining loyal troops, a cry was heard from within the castle, the cry of women. A moment later, a servant came to him, his face pale. "The Queen, my lord, is dead," he reported. It was believed she had taken her own life. Macbeth received the news with a strange, hollow numbness. There was a time, he thought, when such a word would have terrified him. But he had supped so full with horrors now that nothing could startle him. The news of his wife's death, the woman for whom and with whom he had committed his first great crime, was just another event in a long, meaningless series of disasters. He looked out from the battlements, his gaze distant and weary, and a profound, nihilistic despair washed over him. "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow," he said, his voice a low, empty monotone, "creeps in this petty pace from day to day, to the last syllable of recorded time, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle." He was speaking of his wife's life, but also of his own, of all life. "Life's but a walking shadow," he continued, "a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage, and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing." This was the end result of his ambition. Not glory, not peace, but this, a bone-deep conviction that all of existence was a meaningless, chaotic, and idiotic story. It was in this moment of profound despair that the final prophecy came undone. A messenger, a scout from the watchtower, ran to him, his face a mask of gibbering terror. He swore that as he was watching from his post, he had looked towards Burnham Wood, and the forest had begun to move. "Liar and slave!" Macbeth roared, but the scout's terror was too genuine to be a lie. A cold, final dread washed over Macbeth. The impossible had happened. The prophecy that had been his shield was now a weapon turned against him. He began to doubt the equivocations of the fiends that had lied to him with truths. There was no more hope of a long reign, no more hope of a peaceful death. There was nothing left but to die as the man he once was, a soldier. "Blow, wind, come, rack!" he roared. "At least we'll die with harness on our back." He ordered the alarum bells to be rung and stormed out into the castle courtyard to meet his fate. The battle for Dunsinane began. Macbeth fought with the ferocious, desperate courage of a cornered bear, cutting down all who stood in his path. He faced and killed the brave young seaward, and for a moment his confidence surged again. The boy was born of woman. He was still invincible, but his charmed life was running out. Through the chaos of the battle, one man was searching for him, and for him alone. It was Macduff, his heart burning with the cold fire of vengeance. They finally met in the upper courtyard of the castle, two great warriors, the tyrant and the avenger. "Turn, hellhound, turn!" Macduff roared. "Of all men else I have avoided thee," Macbeth said, a flicker of something that might have been guilt in his voice. "But get thee back. My soul is too much charged with blood of thine already." "I have no words," Macduff replied, his voice a low growl of pure hatred. "My voice is in my sword." They fought. It was a battle of titans, the clash of their swords echoing off the ancient stones. Macbeth, secure in his charmed life, taunted his opponent. "Thou losest labour," he snarled. "Let fall thy blade on vulnerable crests. I bear a charmed life which must not yield to one of woman born." "Despair thy charm," Macduff roared back as he pressed his attack. And then he delivered the final, devastating truth, the last piece of the witch's deceptive puzzle. And let the angel whom thou still hast served tell thee, Macduff was from his mother's womb untimely ripped. He had not been born in the natural way. He had been delivered by a caesarean section. Macbeth stared at him, his blood running cold. In that instant, he understood everything. He understood the cunning semantic tricks of the prophecies, the half-truths designed to lure him to his own damnation. His final shield had been shattered. His courage, his will to fight, deserted him. "I'll not fight with thee," he stammered. "Then yield thee, coward," Macduff commanded, "and live to be the show and gaze of the time. We'll have thee, as our rarer monsters are, painted upon a pole, and under it, here may you see the tyrant." The word coward was the final spur. The last dregs of the old Macbeth, the valiant soldier who had once been the hero of Scotland, rose up. He would not be paraded in shame. He would die a warrior. "I will not yield," he roared, his voice once again full of a desperate, defiant fury. "To kiss the ground before young Malcolm's feet, and to be baited with the rabble's curse. Though Burnham wood be come to Dunsinane, and thou opposed, being of no woman born, yet I will try the last." He raised his shield and charged, his final act a roar of defiance against the fate he had so terribly misunderstood. The two men clashed in a final brutal exchange, and Macduff, his sword guided by the memory of his slaughtered wife and children, finally drove his blade home. A short time later, the victorious army gathered in the great hall of the castle. The sounds of battle had been replaced by the cheers of liberation. Malcolm, the young and rightful king, stood before his loyal thanes, but one man was missing. Then Macduff entered. In his hand, he held a pole, and on its top, gruesomely, was the severed head of the tyrant, Macbeth. "Hail, King!" he cried, his voice ringing with triumph and relief. "For so thou art. Behold, where stands the usurper's cursed head? The time is free." A great roar of "Hail, King of Scotland!" went up from the assembled thanes. Malcolm, his eyes filled with a quiet, sorrowful wisdom that was beyond his years, accepted the crown. He named his thanes the first Earls of Scotland, a new honour for a new era. He promised to call home their exiled friends who had fled the tyrant's reign, and to bring to justice the cruel ministers of the dead butcher and his fiend-like queen. And so, as the cheers echoed through the halls of Dunsinane, the land of Scotland, wounded and scarred, began its long, slow journey towards healing. The unnatural darkness had lifted, and the sun was finally beginning to shine on a kingdom that was, at last, free. The terrible, bloody tale of sound and fury had ended, and in its place, a new and hopeful story was ready to begin. And so, our story comes to its quiet conclusion. The crown is restored, the tyrant is fallen, and the long night in Scotland is finally over. The echoes of battle fade, replaced by the promise of a new and gentle dawn. Thank you for sharing this time with me, for letting this old tale unfold at its own peaceful pace. I hope it has been a comfort to you, a quiet companion in the still hours. As you now prepare to let the story go, to let it drift away like a fading dream, I hope you find yourself in a place of deep and peaceful rest. May your own world be free of troubled shadows, and may your sleep be sound, restorative, and filled with the sweetest, gentlest dreams. Until we meet again for another story, I wish you a very calm and very good night.